Chapter 1002. Chapter 1002 Energy Purification, ping. 3,923 units. Lionel's eyes opened wide in shock. This little fish was 30 times more valuable than Little Black Star? At least the Little Black Star before he ingested the void beast blood. Lionel appeared around the halo of the golden-scaled koi fish, his mind running in overdrive. This fish was very unique. Even now, Lionel could feel the wild surges of force that was coming from the ball of light that hung out from its mouth. However, to him this was just the tip of the iceberg. This koi fish had actually been able to disrupt Lionel's mind for a moment, there was no doubt about that. For Lionel, who was very much used to being nearly infallible when it came to matters of his mind, this was both a scary and intriguing truth. The latest _soties are on the website. The reality of the matter was that the boundaries of Lionel's mind had fifth-dimensional protection ever since he was in the third dimension. In fact, back when Lionel was in the third dimension, he had even been able to ignore the mental coercion of a fourth-dimensional variant invalid. But now that he, himself, was in the fifth dimension and was also beginning to meet opponents at that level, those protections would slowly become less and less impressive. Unless Lionel took steps to create mental protections for himself, he would only become more vulnerable as time went on. So, in a lot of ways he had to thank this koi fish for revealing this weakness to him. On the other hand, he was curious. This koi fish seemed to have the ability to gather up force. Its affinity for force was so great that it could even overrule a force's natural tendency to bend it to its will. The question, though, was what did this have to do with the mental coercion Lionel had experienced? It's not that large of a logical leap. With all the types of forces that this koi fish can control, who's to say that there isn't one particularly good at mental coercion? I can't use my dream force to force people into illusions, but there are those with different abilities to my own that do rely on dream force to do exactly that. It's possible, then, that this koi fish made use of this branch of dream force to place me in a trance. But that only makes it more embarrassing that I actually almost fell for it. Lionel shook his head. Every time he felt he had a grasp on the dimensional verse, he would get blindsided with something new. For a person like him who liked to be prepared for every possible variable, it was a bit frustrating. In the past, he used to blame his recklessness for this, but he had weeded much of that out of his system long ago. After all, he had so many dream counters in place to deal with things, that was evidence of his caution. The main issue, though, was that it felt almost inevitable that there'd come a day where his dream counters wouldn't have an appropriate countermeasure. By then it would be too late to regret. The latest _soties are on the website. Lionel sighed. He knew that worrying about this was useless, just like his fear of missing out was also useless. Simply put, he didn't know what he didn't know. But, for Lionel, who liked to be in control of things and build a logical structure to his life, he found this particularly hard to accept. Lionel reached a hand forward and scooped at the water the golden-scaled koi fish lay in. Thanks to Vice basically freezing everything, he just had to manipulate his own spatial force to form barriers. The result was a sphere of hovering water holding a frozen fish. The golden-scaled koi fish regained the ability to move thanks to Lionel's barrier blocking it from Vice's ability, but there was nowhere it could go. It continuously rammed against the barriers, but it quickly became obvious that it was just harming itself. Calm down, I'm not going to eat you. Lionel chuckled before immediately frowning. This koi fish had really caused too many problems. Who knew how many had died because of its actions? Under normal circumstances, Lionel would be pissed off about it. And yet, he had actually chuckled and laughed. The charisma of this koi fish was really too much. Lionel felt like he almost forgave it entirely. This must be some sort of evolutionary protective mechanism. Its pseudo-symbiotic relationship with the tentacle womb isn't natural, so it had to survive in other ways before it formed this codependency. Its ability to be likable is probably what protected it. 30 times. 30 times, visit. For a better user experience, Lionel really couldn't wrap his head around it. The only explanation was that this koi fish's ability was beyond what Little Black Star could match. But the reality was that Lionel felt this koi fish was no better than his segmented cube. Couldn't his segmented cube also gather up energy? In fact, not only could it gather it up, but it could even form crystals and pure crystals out of this force, making it far more valuable than this koi fish. Unable to figure it out, Lionel chose to cover all of his bases. What is the ability of this koi fish? Ping. Energy purification. Wait. Lionel's dreamscape sparked, something within his mind churning. Visit. For the best he experienced, a flood of questions came from his mouth, each more pointed than the last as he zeroed in on the answers he wanted. As he spoke, A plan of action continuously formed in his mind and his gaze grew brighter. By the end of it all, he looked toward the koi fish as though it was a priceless treasure, his heart thumping madly. Lionel carefully placed the golden-scaled koi fish into the large lake of cleansing waters and sent the tentacle wound to be slowly healed back to its peak condition. Then he picked up vice and candle before shooting off into the distance, his intent blazing. Chapter 1003? Chapter 1003 Connecting the ocean and the sky. The royal blue basin was a complete mess. Many of the cruisers were nothing more than scraps of metal, the lives and deaths of several were either unknown or never had a chance at the former, while those who survived were beaten and bloodied, finding it difficult even to breathe properly. This wave was far worse than the previous ones and even now was still raging on. There had been a slight moment of reprieve when the koi fish released its dense ball of energy. But after Vice appeared and that world was cut off from the invalids, they had once again charged back toward the coast and the raining waters. The only good news was that the heavy and dense clouds above were beginning to slowly disperse and the rain was weakening. Like this, they could be certain that this was the last wave. They just had to survive this. Just this. I'd rather be running suicides. Gil felt like his legs might fall off at any moment. He was supposed to be a speedster proud of his speed. But, quite frankly, he wanted nothing to do with anything related to running any longer. All he could do was squeeze out currents of lightning in hopes of stopping these colossal creatures from assaulting the coast anymore. By now, the military units had finally taken action. Large ballistae were firing and several cruisers had been sacrificed for the sake of battering ram maneuvers. However, it somehow felt that the road ahead was endless. That said, there was good news too. They could finally claim the force from the invalids they were killing. The only unfortunate part was that while this helped with morale, it didn't do much for their stamina. Visit. For a better user experience, invalids released a unique energy that strengthened a person, but this strengthening happened toward one's bottlenecks and progression, not necessarily toward one's immediate state. Even a breakthrough wouldn't bring their bodies back to tip-top shape as though nothing had happened. Unless, of course, they were breaking through a major dimensional barrier. There was another reason this rose morale, though. The 8 brothers were certain that this change had something to do with Lionel. Not just the rain dispersing, but this control they regained over invalids was definitely a sign that he had succeeded. Cap needs to hurry back. I'm dying over here. Raj groaned, sending another powerful fist forward. The heavy metallic sand his controlled was only getting heavier by the minute. But this point he couldn't even kill these creatures with a single blow any longer, he could only tear into their bodies and hope to rip them from the inside out. Some left tackle you are, Franco chided. You're supposed to be protecting Cap's blind side, not the other way around. I protected him for 10 years already, damn it. It's my turn to get protected. You think that just because I'm so big and muscular that I don't deserve love? Several gazes fell onto Raj at that moment, scanning him up and down. It could be said that only redeeming quality about Raj was his smooth brown skin. It was clear that it was soft and well taken care of. They all knew that Raj had an obsession with lotion. However, that was where it all stopped. Raj was almost 2 meters tall, but he seemed just as wide. His torso was so big that his long legs seemed small by comparison. And his fat was so layered that it caused his clothing to fold in several layers along with it. The latest _IP_SODIs are on the website. Muscular? Why was it that they couldn't tell this? You all need to stop ogling my immaculate physique. I'm a person, not an object for you to drool over. Have some common decency. At that moment, the fluttering laughter of several beauties drifted over. Joyce, Alina and the others couldn't stand Raj's jokes anymore. But it was about the only thing that kept their heads straight amidst all the fatigue that was weighing down on their shoulders. Shit. It's another one. Joel's voice cut through the noise and roaring waves. In the distance, a billowing pillar of water seemed to connect the ocean's surface and the skies above. The pressure was so fierce and the sound so loud that Joel's voice was quickly drowned out by it all before heavy, pelting drops of water began to rain down. It was yet another enormous whale. They had been appearing one after another and were easily the most dangerous of the creatures yet. Bang, 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 bang. The water rained down like bullets, growing harder and harder with each passing moment. In the distance, a soldier who didn't get out of the way in time was hit head-on, his skull being driven into the deck of his cruiser. By the time the water dispersed and his face was revealed, a large dent was left in his head as his eyes stared vacantly into space. Dead. Milan. Joel roared. Visit. For a better user experience, already on it. Milan clapped his hands together, the last dregs of his force being dragged up as he roared with everything he had. His energy shield exploded in size, growing from 2 meters to hundreds of meters in the blink of an eye. Veins popped up across Milan's forehead, blood seeping between his teeth as he tried to force his energy shield to grow in size. However, as it grew, it also became thinner, causing the heavy droplets of water to crash through, shattering some sections into pieces. Milan continued to hold on, his blood silently falling into the ocean beneath him. His own energy shield began to fuse with that of others with similar abilities, large sections of defensive formations glowing blinding lights as they lifted into the sky. Right then, though, the worst-case scenario occurred. A second pillar of water connected the ocean to the skies. But this one came from a completely different location than the first. A second whale had appeared. And just behind it there came a third. Just 2 today. Back with 4 tomorrow unless something happens, visit. For a better user experience. Chapter 1004. Chapter 1004. Boiling point. A heaviness took over the atmosphere, even more dark and pregnant than it had already been before. Just a single volley of this heavy rain had already taken so many lives, it was impossible to imagine a scenario where they could truly survive such an onslaught. These whales came from the truest depths of the ocean. Their skin was so pale and sickly that it was impossible to conclude that they had ever seen even a drop of sunlight in their lives. But this was also what gave them impossibly strong bodies. Not only were their walls of tough, rubbery skin and thick blubber nearly impossible to penetrate, but their bones were used to the high pressure of the ocean's deep waters. On top of this, their bodies were also suited to dealing with rapid changes in this pressure and had adapted such that they could use this to their advantage. The scariest truth that came from this was the fact that their abilities had nothing to do with the water pillars that came from their blowholes and was rather just a release of this obscene pressure their bodies were prepared to adapt to. This was the true fearsome nature of the dimensional verse. These whales had yet to even display their true lethality and were only taking a breath. And yet, this singular breath had already cost the lives of hundreds. Right that very moment, a third water pillar shot into the air as the third whale also took its breath. An apocalyptic disaster fell from the skies. Water droplets as large as half a human's body fell, keeping their shape and form beneath the globules of snot that came from the whale's blowhole. Despite the grotesque image, each held a lethal capability of a small grenade, pelting holes even into the tough exterior of the remaining cruise ships. Visit. For the best no_vil_underscored_ng experience, we can't continue to be passive. Joel immediately took command. It was one thing when they believed there had only been a single whale, but now that there were 3 they couldn't continue to sit back and drain Milan of whatever small amount of stamina he had left. If they didn't charge forward and end this quickly, there was no telling if these whales would take action again. From experience, Joel knew that invalids lacked intelligence, but living oceanic beasts were no less crafty than humans were. Most of the invalids had already been dealt with, and it was clear at a glance that these 3 whales were normal beasts. If not for this, they wouldn't have been patient enough to both evade Lionel's detection and only attack at this crucial time. They had even staggered their appearances so they would be truly caught off guard. Without Lionel here, it was a given that Joel would take the helm. Not a single one of them raised a word of protest. "Arnold, how much do you have left in the tank?" "However much is needed." Arnold replied plainly, neither his voice nor his expression having shifted a single iota since the very beginning. "Milan Drake, you 2 will be tasked with Raj and Alan's safety. Raj, you and Alan will need to synergize for this. Just follow everything Alan says and it'll be fine. Visit. For a better user experience. Clearly, Joel and Alan had a tacit understanding about something which didn't need to be said aloud. Without even communicating, Alan had already sprung into action, his ability kicking into high gear as he gave Raj command after command. Even though Raj was a jokester, he knew how to follow instructions, and he most definitely knew when he needed to be serious. "Gil and Franco, you 2 will support the moon people." When Joel said this, his gaze turned over to meet Carolus' eyes. "Can you do it?" Seeing the confidence in Joel's gaze, Carolus was taken aback a bit. As far as he was concerned, he felt that Lionel was the leader of this group. What he hadn't expected was for them to suddenly pull it together in the face of danger as though Lionel wasn't needed at all. But this was exactly what the truth was. Lionel wasn't needed. These 8 had been surviving in the dimensional verse without Lionel by their side for years already. They weren't the same as these moon youths waiting for careless action. The latest _IP_SODIs are on the website. I can take one. Carolus nodded. Joel's gaze flashed. Good. Then we'll take the other 2. Joel didn't wait for a response as he dashed forward, cutting a path across the water. To his side, Arnold followed, sticking to him like glue. To the two of them, nothing had changed. Joel was the captain of the defense, the head hunter at the linebacker position. As for Arnold, he was the anchor of the defensive line, the defensive tackle. It was his stability that allowed Joel to run wild. When they came together, the world would feel their power. The scene of two youth men streaking through the no-man's land between the three whales and what remained of their coastal defenses was imprinted onto the minds of all that were there. Whether consciously or unconsciously, they came to accept that there was still a chance to survive. At that moment, the center whale opened its mouth, rows of brownish-yellow bristles appearing. They looked absolutely harmless at first before they all turned rigid at once, lighting on fire in unison. Visit. For a better user experience in a sight that was one for the ages, the bristles separated from the whale's mouth, shooting out like arrows that rose the temperature of the surrounding oceans by dozens of degrees. Under the astonished gazes of those watching on, and much to their horror, Joel and Arnold were swallowed by this flow of flaming bristles, a huge billow fog of steam rising from the air as the waters reached a boiling point. At that moment, as the steam rose into the skies above, the slowly dispersing clouds suddenly regained their life, growing more and more powerful. The light drizzle of rain seemed to recover, a heavy precipitation weighing on all their souls once more. Chapter 1005. Chapter 1005. Ready? Not good. Careless pupils constricted. He had thought that they would charge together, but Joel and Arnold had actually gone ahead on their own. But that wasn't even the main problem. Even if the two managed to come out unscathed, the battlefield had completely changed with the billowing steam. Let alone the fact they would need to protect themselves from the boiling steam, but their vision would also be obstructed, making it more difficult to coordinate their movements. Within the third dimension, hot steam from freshly boiled water could already cause severe burns. Fire hot enough to boil fifth-dimensional waters were even more exaggerated. It was like Joel and Arnold were under a perpetual deadly assault from all sides. Damn it. Stay here. Carolus made a decision, about to dash forward. Don't go. Franco and Gil stopped Carolus. The two were practically mortal enemies usually, however at the moment, they had a tacit understanding. Joel had told them to help Carolus and the other moon people, but there was a clear hidden meaning behind his words which was quite simple. Don't let them mess anything up. At that moment, two shadows suddenly surged out from the fog. No, it wasn't that they had surged out of it, the steam had grown far too tall and covered a space far too wide for that. Instead, they had dispersed the steam around them, their force billowing like a raging torrent. Visit. For a better user experience, Arnold took the helm, universal force the likes of which made the very ocean surface itself tremble for several kilometers rising out from him. Images of a trembling asteroid belt rotating about a golden moon hung high above his head, illuminating the endless fog in his image. His large palms shook, the energy around them growing in size to the point it dwarfed the head of the whale beneath his. His expression went from indifferent to ferocious. It was the kind of look that had always been hidden beneath his football helmet on the field but was now displayed prominently for all to see. It struck fear in their hearts. It made blood run cold. It made the wind itself turn still, hanging in the air as though purposely waiting for Arnold's next action just so that it could escape. Bang! Right then, the palm descended, deforming the head of the blue whale into the form of a hand and 5 fingers. The sound alone was loud that it drowned out the thunderous booms of the clouds above, and the devastation was so potent that the left and right whales were sent sprawling just by the ocean waves alone. However, Arnold himself wasn't satisfied with his strike. He could tell that the whale's skull hadn't given way beneath his power. In fact, though its head had deformed, much of that was just its thick skin and fat being displaced irregularly. That said, Arnold's strike wasn't useless. It stopped the fire bristle whale from being able to send out another strike immediately. Not only had it been sent several hundred meters into the water below, but whales had brains as well. It most definitely wasn't immune to being disoriented and concussed. That left just enough time for Joel to prepare his own strike. Like clockwork, Joel appeared by Arnold's side, both of them riding atop the massive wave the latter's attack had caused. Joel's dark skin danced with light as he concentrated strength within his halberd. Space trembled and cracked as his forearm flexed, keeping a tight control. The latest _AP_SODIES are on the website. Suddenly, he opened his eyes and smiled in Arnold's direction. Just like old times, how buddy? Arnold's expression having returned to an eerie calm. But his words came out smoothly. I pinned them down. Joel's smile turned to a grin. And he'll take their heads. It was at exactly that moment that the fire bristle whale rebounded out of the ocean, the waters surging forward to quickly fill in the empty space. Joel's halberd descended in a devastating arc, aiming for the thinnest and most vulnerable location within the injury Arnold had caused it. As far as Joel was concerned, this whale was nothing more than tenderized meat. A blinding light of blade chi drew and lined through the sky, piercing through the whale's skin and through its skull. An ear-tearing roar shook the skies filled with a mournful plea, but it was already too late. Gasping for breath, Joel fell back to the ocean's surface as the wave they stood upon faltered. He was completely spent. Even before this attack, he had already been running on nearly empty, but now it was far worse. His lungs felt like he was breathing in the very steam fog that had threatened to char him to ash just moments earlier. Visit. For a better user experience, Arnold caught Joel by the arm, helping him to stabilize himself as they retreated. As the coarse and foul blood of the fire bristle whale began to pool in the dark waters, the two young men suddenly found themselves having their auras locked onto by two extraordinarily enraged whales. What they hadn't been aware originally was that these three whales were actually brothers. And, unlike many beasts of the third dimension, these fifth dimension beasts actually had concepts of kinship and camaraderie. Arnold's own force reserves had long since run on empty. He could only use what universal force had left to fuel himself. But he was quickly running out the focus he needed to sustain it. As for Joel, he was only able to remain upright with Arnold's support. It was clear that taking out a single whale had already been their upper limit. The two could only run with everything they had left, rushing to get away from the two enormous whales that were out to seek revenge. However, neither had an ounce of panic on their faces. As for why, that much was obvious. They had 6 other brothers. In the distance, Alan gave Raj a final command as his magnetic ability began to take action, his force surging in large, rolling waves. Even as he worked, his gaze was locked onto the two in the distance. Around Alan and Raj, Drake continuously fired at the large droplets of water falling the skies, bursting the mucous membranes and rendering their lethality useless. Ready? Ready. Visit. For a better user experience under Alan and Raj's prowess, a crude railgun rose up from ocean's surface, its menacing tip aiming for the whale closest to the running pair. Chapter 1006. Chapter 1006. Sound wave beads of sweat fell down Raj's brows. He had to put in his everything just to get this thing finished in time, and he still wasn't even sure of what it did. However, if it could be said that Joel was the best leader they had after Lionel, then it could also be said that Alan had the greatest mind after him as well. In fact, before Lionel awakened to his ability, it was Alan who was ranked first over both him and Aina in Class A. The railgun was pieced together with Raj's metallic sand and squeezed until it formed a crystalline structure stronger than anything Diamond could match up against. Its barrel had a top half and a bottom half separated by a gap just perfect to fit in a ballista Alan had long since slotted in. From a certain angle, it almost looked like the maw of a dragon, force pulsing about the tip of its barrel as Alan poured everything he had into it. Drake. Drake didn't need to be told twice. As the pure marksman of the group, he had already known exactly who would be tasked with shooting this shot. This is everything I've got, Alan said solemnly. The latest _SODIs are on the website. Leave it to me. Drake's gaze glowed, a confidence that exuded from his bones pervading his surroundings. The metamorphosis had descended long before Drake got the chance to do so, but it had to be remembered that Drake was the heir apparent chosen to replace Lionel after he graduated by Coach Owen himself. He might have been a rookie 4 years ago, but now he had grown into his own man and had the broad back to prove it. He grabbed onto the railgun's 2 anchor points, his gaze locking onto the distance. He could see Joel and Arnold running for their life, the fatigue painted on their faces being as clear as day. It looked as though they just might collapse at any time, their stamina running out before they could do anything. However, Drake's gaze could also see the look in their eyes. Over the several kilometers that separated them, their gazes met. That look of confidence was one that he would never forget. Such a big, slow-moving target. Drake grinned. As if I could miss. Bang. The sound of the railgun firing resounded like a cacophonic boom, but it was quickly drowned out by a whistle so loud it felt as though it could be heard around the world. The recoil was devastating, the ocean waves around them being no less violent than when Arnold palmed the fire bristle whale into the ocean. The latest _SODIs are on the website. Drake could feel his arms fracturing even beneath Raj's control. The latter had done everything he could do to mitigate the recoil, but even then both of Drake's arms became useless in the end. However, Drake didn't even seem to notice, his gaze focused on the projectile that was currently splitting the ocean in two. It was so fast that it seemed to teleport. A single blink would cause it to vanish across hundreds of meters. In fact, it had already appeared by the second whale by the time the first wave of pain was registered by Drake's mind. The whale's tough exterior was like a wet piece of paper. It didn't even seem to register what had happened to it until it swam forward half a kilometer more, bearing down on the Joel-Arnold pair with every intention of swallowing them whole. As expected, for the intelligent whales to try to obstruct their vision with steam, one of them had to have an auxiliary ability capable of helping them to maneuver such an environment. Joel and Arnold just happened to be lucky enough that the whale that recovered the quickest to rush after them was exactly this whale, leaving it with no other option of attack. It was then that a second mournful cry in just as many minutes resounded. This one, though, was particularly somber, as though it was well aware it was leaving its last brother alone. Maybe that was why it was instantly followed by a roar the likes of which shook the battlefield. The sound wave of the roar alone sent wave after wave of dark waters spreading outward. Cruisers that got caught in the mess were upended and flipped. Even Joel and Arnold, who were in the process of running away, was hit by a wall of this sound, their bones threatening to fracture beneath the pressure as they were sent flying. Visit. For the best no understanding experience, Joel. Arnold. Gil's gaze flashed. He took a deep breath, his chest expanding as he dug deep. With a bang he shot forward. Arcs of lightning followed his steps as he sliced through the sound wave. It felt almost like he was trying to run in water, his limbs pushing as hard as they could for less than half the usual result. But he knew that he was the only one who could get to those two in time. Joel and Arnold had already expended what force they had left. Being so close to that sound wave, they had definitely taken the brunt of the pressure. With force to protect them and under such a fatigued state, they had already lost consciousness. If no one went after them, they'd be finished. Careless gaze flashed. Space fractured around him as he anchored himself. The moment he did this, it was as though he was standing in a world different from everyone else, and the sound wall vanished. He rushed after Gil. At this point it was a free-for-all. If he didn't take action now, when would he? The devastation that shook the coast only seemed to be getting worse with every passing moment. However, it was then that the final whale stopped roaring, its blood-red gaze rising from the ocean and bearing down on everyone before it as though the world itself was its enemy. Visit. For the best no understanding experience at that moment, a pressure crushed down from above, compressing the water and forcing many to pour more force toward their feet so that they could stay afloat. The whale raised its tail, bloody murder marring its gaze. Chapter 1007. Chapter 1007. Halt. The sudden shift in the gravity caught many completely off guard. Those that were unable to react in time found themselves forced beneath the ocean's surface, struggling to swim back up to no avail. Panic took hold of the coastal defenses once again. This kind of cruel use of a gravitational ability was far more devastating on the open waters than it ever could be on land. The horrible sight of numerous valiant soldiers being drowned one after another was a sight that shook those that managed to stay above water to their cores. Fourth-dimensional existences could hold their breaths for far longer than most third-dimensional existences could, but this didn't mean they could do so indefinitely. The gravity whale had suddenly placed a timer on all their lives, a cruel light pervading its gaze. Damn it! Gil roared, his steps having slowed considerably. He poured everything he had into his forward momentum, but he was still a step too late. Joel and Arnold crashed into the waters. They already hadn't had any force remaining. How could they possibly scrounge up enough to resist the pull of the waters? Joel? Arnold? Gil's gaze turned bloodshot. He hadn't made it in time. The worst part was that he knew if he dove into the waters after them now, there was no way that whale would allow him to resurface. Fighting against such gravity in the water felt almost impossible. Visit. For the best no understanding experience. Fuck. Franco's gaze was just as red as Gil's. In fact, the same went for all of them. Those two were their brothers. How could they not react this way? Franco swept his gaze through the moon people before he landed on Alina. He knew that of them all, Alina most definitely had the best chance at saving them, only she could manipulate these waters even if it would be more difficult beneath the gravity field. Franco didn't waste any time and grabbed Alina's waist, hoisting her over his shoulder and shooting forward. Franco knew what he was doing was wrong. He had no right to force someone else to risk their life for his own brother, but he couldn't just sit by and do nothing. He was the only one who felt like he hadn't contributed anything. Of all of Lionel's brothers, Franco's ability was the least flashy. All he had was the strength of his body, but he had worked it to the bone. If he couldn't blast through this curtain of gravity, then what good was his strength to begin with? "I'm sorry," Franco said as he shot ahead. "But I can promise you that if one of us is going to die, it will be me. If the both of us are going to die, it will be me first." Alina, who had been caught off guard by Franco's actions and couldn't muster up the strength to fight back against his power, obviously not expecting one of their own to suddenly scoop her up like this, stopped resisting when she heard this. The words resonated with her heart. The latest _AP_SODIES are on _that website. "Don't worry about me," Alina called out to her teammates, letting Franco carry her instead the distance. "If anything happens to her..." Joyce couldn't push through the curtain of gravity as easily as Franco could. Without anyone to turn her rage on, she turned a red gaze toward Milan and the others. But what she found there was shocking to an extreme. All of them who remained, Milan, Drake, Alan, Raj, each and every one of them lowered their heads in the direction of the moon people. Even without saying a word, their sincerest apologies were as crystal clear as a blue sky. Despite not seeing their gazes, Joyce, who had been stunned into silence, could imagine them. She could sense a resolve that came even without them saying a single thing. Though Franco's words hadn't managed to reach her ears as they had been for Alina and Alina alone, Joyce could tell that these four who remained had the resolve to take their own lives should anything happen to her. Whatever rage Alina had deflated like a leaking balloon. She couldn't find it within herself to be pissed off any longer. Franco's muscles pumped and pulsed. His somewhat fair skin was filled with blotches of bruised fibers as he pushed his body to its limits, but he didn't seem to notice in the slightest. From over 2 kilometers away he crossed the distance, cutting it in half then cutting it by another half. The latest _AP_SODIES are on _that website. Gil, who had already noticed Franco's approach, rushed back as fast as he could. But, despite the fact that the gravity curtain became weaker the further he went, that didn't change the fact it was there. In the time it took Franco to cross almost 2 kilometers, Gil had crossed just 100 meters. But it was still enough for them to meet. Franco's face was covered in sweat, his cheeks even becoming somewhat hollow. All the nutrients in his body seemed to have gone to his limbs, pushing him forward one stride at a time. Without a single word, Gil clasped a hand to Franco's shoulder, pouring speedster lightning force into him. Franco tossed Gil over his other shoulder and shot forward again, his speed more than doubling what it had been before. However, the strain on his muscles only grew worse. His muscle fibers tore, his bones threatened to fracture and his knees grinded against one another, thinning his cartilage one layer at a time. "Alina," Franco gasped out. He entered the general area of where Joel and Arnold had been forced beneath the water. "I've sensed them already. I got it," Alina replied, not trying to move from Franco's shoulder. She was under no illusions that she could survive beneath this gravity curtain without Franco's support. "I got them. I got them." In the distance, the looming gaze of the gravity whale hung like 2 crimson orbs. After it had activated its ability, it seemed to have lost the ability to move, its rising tail having long since come to a halt. Visit for a better _user experience. Chapter 1008? Chapter 1008 Fuck You, Bonus Chapter. Veins pulsed through Alina's delicate brow, her face reddening beneath the strain as she released a low shout. Joel and Arnold were ripped out of the waters, their consciousnesses still not having been regained. Panic took hold of Franco's heart as he wondered just how much water they had swallowed, but he didn't have the luxury of finding out now, he needed to bring everyone back. Franco dug deep, pulling out everything he had. He stacked 2 people to each one of his shoulders, taking heavy steps back toward the coast. Every time his leg rose and fell, violent ripples of water would surge through, forming tall waves that drenched him through from head to toe. Blood leaked between his teeth as he stomped back. He knew that the gravity whale was behind him, but he also knew that it had a choice to make. If it moved, the curtain of gravity would vanish as Franco had enough distance to shoot away. However, if it didn't move, then Franco would just continue adding to the distance between them. Even if he had to turn his bones into dust, he would bring them out of here. Unfortunately, what actually happened was far out of their expectations. The curtain of gravity suddenly shifted as the whale's tail twitched. As though it was playing a cruel game with them all, the range of the curtain shrunk and began to concentrate on Franco. Bang! Unable to control what was happening, Franco fell to a single knee, feeling as though his bones had splintered. The pain was so excruciating that the blood vessels in his eyes popped, filling his whites with a crimson hue. Franco roared, pushing himself back up inch by inch. But, visit. For the best no understanding experience back. The gravity curtain multiplied again, slamming Franco's knee back onto the waters. It was a cruel fate. Franco had no choice but to coat his knee with force to stop himself from sinking. But it was also exactly this rigidity that was harming him, yet he had no choice but to accept it. At that moment, Carolus, who had been trying to force his way over as well but had been stalled by the gravity curtain, watched on with bloodshot eyes. Gravity was a perfect counter to his spatial affinity as they were inextricably linked to one another. This gravity curtain made it almost impossible for him to crack space like he usually did, especially since this whale was in the fifth dimension while he was not. Bang. Franco couldn't stop his second knee from hitting the water. He tried to keep his back as straight as possible, but even that was beginning to bend. Alina gasped for breath, his stamina having been drained to its limits. Every time she tried to control the waters, it would gurgle and ignore her. This was the first time she had ever experienced such a thing in her life, but it was also because she knew she had pushed herself too far to pull Joel and Arnold out. Fuck. Franco's teeth cracked beneath the power of his clenched jaw. He pushed himself as far as he could. But no matter what he tried, he couldn't seem to rise back up. He could feel his vision swimming, but his will was raging like an endless torrent. His mind was repeating just a single thought: he wouldn't stop until he died. Until his nerves gave out, until his brain shut down, until his heart burst from pumping too hard. He wouldn't stop pushing. Franco roared to the point his throat was torn to shreds. However, this pain seemed to be like an escape from everything else he was feeling. The latest _sodies are on the website. Under astonished gazes, he rose back up to a knee, his toes bending and his ankles arching as he pushed his body forward. Even if he couldn't stand to his feet anymore, so what? He could still push himself forward like this. Franco could feel an endless torrent of force coming to him from Gil. He knew that Gil was also at the end of his rope, scrounging up whatever small bit of will he had left to try and support his supposed enemy. It was only Franco that was well aware that he would have run out of force long ago if not for Gil sacrificing as well. The whale's gaze flashed, a furious light entering its eyes as though it couldn't believe the audacity of these ants to still continue struggling. But, if they could barely survive against this, what would they do against its true strength? Bang, bang, bang. Franco could no longer lift his knee, nor could he keep his back straight. His face crashed into the waters, feeling like a resounding slap to the face. I can't. Franco held the four up on his back, coating his forehead with force and using it to push himself forward. It was the kind of scene that made one's blood boil with rage and indignance. The rage of the whale was no less, though. It felt as though its ploy to play these humans to death continuously slapped his face, making it absolutely furious. It wanted nothing more than to crush these humans beneath its enormous weight. It opened its mouth and roared again. But, beneath the suppression of its gravity curtain, the waves couldn't even rise up. A sonic boom of sound shattered their eardrums one after another, threatening to rip Franco to pieces. Without being able to be sent flying, the strength of the sound wave couldn't be dissipated and Franco was forced to take on the brunt of it, his mouth coughing up several mouthfuls of blood. He felt his vision swimming as something within him snapped. The last dregs of energy Gil had was already sapped clean. What Franco hadn't noticed was that it was also Gil's lightning that kept his mind awake. But the moment it ran out, visit. For a better user experience, Franco collapsed, the weight on his back pushing him into the waters below. However, just when it seemed that their heroic tale would truly end here, a hand reached down and touched his shoulder, shrouding him in an energy shield that seemed to render the gravity curtain completely useless. Carolus' pupils constricted. Who is that? The young man lifted Franco and the others up and out of the water, his gaze filled with a furious light as he gazed toward the gravity whale. From top to bottom, the young man was coated in a beautiful blue light. It surrounded him like a halo, making him seem like a deity descended from some world above. Fuck you, the young man said coldly. He reached out a hand, causing the whale to suddenly become enveloped by an energy shield of blue that was eerily similar to the halo that surrounded him. Caught off guard, the whale couldn't react in time. It found that its gravity curtain was suddenly concentrated in its immediate surroundings, its own power being turned against it. Its flesh collapsed and a pained howl left it. Unfortunately, even the sound wave rebounded against the barrier, causing its own voice to tear at its skin. The young man's hand rose up high, lifting the whale that must have been almost a kilometer long as though it was nothing more than feather. He squeezed. The energy shield of blue morphed, forming spikes that pierced the whale's body through. Its harsh cry turned to gurgles that eventually died out completely. All that was left was an energy shield hovering in the air like a sack of flesh and blood. The latest _AP_SODIES are on _the website. At that moment, a blazing light appeared from the distance like a streak of gold cutting across the skies. When that light came to a grinding halt, another young man appeared, this one far more recognizable to the masses. Lionel looked around the battlefield, his pupils constricting. But when he saw the young man with his hand raised in the air, his expression evened out to the point it neared placid. James. Chapter 1009. Chapter 1009 Vale James Bennett. Much like the rest of the talents of Earth, he too had taken advantage of Earth connecting with the wider dimensional verse to explore what lay beyond their world as well. He hadn't ended up going to the same location as the rest of his former teammates and instead ended up elsewhere. The result was him only recently returning. He had, of course, chosen to come to the coast much like all of Earth's talent had, and he happened to run into this situation the moment he had. Regardless of how he had fallen out with Lionel, the fact remained that these were his brothers as well. They had all grown up together from the time they put their first football pads on to the day they won their last championship. How could James sit idly by and watch them die? Let alone sitting idly, James was actually infuriated and he took it all out on the whale instantly. What he hadn't expected, though, was for his appearance to coincide with Lionel's own so perfectly. Lionel was just a half-minute later than him, or else maybe their roles would have been completely reversed. James was quite used to seeing those eyes of Lionel by now. As Lionel's best friend for over a decade, he had long since come to know Lionel's personality as well as his own. In fact, he wasn't even sure if Lionel understood himself as well as he understood him. Visit. For a better user experience, everyone thought that Lionel was a nice guy who had a bright smile for everyone, but James knew better. He knew that Lionel was a man who was measured in the way he acted and would only make a move when it benefited him the greatest while costing him the least. This was how he moved through life, constantly weighing and balancing things to optimize everything for himself. That gaze Lionel was giving him now was the very same one he gave to anyone he knew nothing about. It wasn't coldness, it wasn't rage or anger, it wasn't even indifference. It was just a placid, vast and endless abyss with a depth impossible to see and a steadiness impossible to match. He would use those eyes to mark down every little detail he could about a target. Only when he was confident in his assessment would he make a move. But the trouble was that Lionel should already understand James well. Giving this sort of look to a young man who should have been the greatest friend you had ever had hit differently. It was worse than experiencing a cold glare, one filled with rage or even indifference. It was as though Lionel was pretending like he had never known the person before him. Flashes of what happened the last time the two met took hold of James' mind. His father had asked him to stall Lionel so that he would end up caught. In truth, James knew that he had lied to himself, convincing himself that Lionel wouldn't be harmed and that he would just be captured. With Lionel's talent, he would be too useful to the fort to maim or kill, so he would eventually be released on his own merits. Visit. For the best no_vel_underscored_ng experience, but deep inside James knew that was a lie. With how much the junior governor Duke hated Lionel and how even Simeon had come for him, how could anyone ever conclude that Lionel would be just fine? The plain and simple truth was that he almost drove Lionel to his death. But those words he said in those moments reverberated the loudest. I'm disappointed. I really took you to be my closest friend? James remembered absolutely snapping when he heard those words. His mind spun and his eyes saw red to the point he released something he had held deep within him for the longest time. Before he could even properly suppress and think about what he had been going to say, it all spilled out. Bullshit. You pretend to care about so many things, you pretend to be kind-hearted, but all you really care about are things ending up exactly like you want them. You don't like killing only because you don't want to deal with the guilt. You don't like playing football only because you didn't get to choose it. You only want to do things your way and nothing else matters. The latest _AP_SODIES are on _the website. You're a fucking sociopathic hypocrite. No one knew Lionel better than James did aside from maybe Lionel's own father. Maybe his words had a tinge of jealousy to them, maybe they were spoken in the heat of the moment, but in all such things there was always a kernel of truth to be found. James' feelings most definitely didn't come from thin air. However, whether or not he had the right to feel this way was a different matter entirely. It was hard to tell just how much had changed in the last few years, if anything at all. James was still tied to his Bennett family, working hard so that they might once more regain their former glory. At least when it came to James, Nothing much had changes aside from his maturing face having gained a bit of stubble to it. As for Lionel, he had probably changed the most between the two. He didn't have such obvious signs of maturity on his face, but unlike his previously aimless self, he now had a goal that he was chasing after just as fervently as James was. It could be said that the greatest difference between them now was that Lionel was fighting for himself while James was fighting for his father and his ancestors before him. Visit. For a better user experience in what could only be considered a twist of ironic fate, then. Lionel hadn't really changed at all in James' estimation, still doing things that benefited himself the most. The veil that separated two men that had once been as inseparable as brothers only seemed even more impossible to penetrate now. Chapter 1010. Chapter 1010. Roni and Exchange. Lionel descended from the skies, landing before James. He checked the condition of Franco, Gil, Joel and Arnold with a frown. When his gaze finally landed on Alina, he realized that she must have been a person of the moon, and he felt a tinge of gratefulness in his heart. Finally he looked up and met James' gaze. He could still remember that Coach Owen had told him that he should forgive and reconcile with him, but as easy as it was for Lionel to turn his emotions off when it came to a person, turning them back on was a tall mountain to climb. It was almost like his natural resting state was unbothered and unmoved, while rising up from this level took effort. As for this effort, those he had deemed unworthy of it would never get it again. "Thank you for saving them," Lionel finally said. "You don't have to thank me for saving my own brothers," James replied, a bit surprised that Lionel's eye level was now even with his own. James had always been taller than Lionel, but it seemed that this would no longer be the case. "Fair enough," Lionel replied. Someone else might have accused James at this point. If he really cared so much for brothers, why would he have taken the actions he had during the past several years? However, Lionel couldn't be bothered with such emotion. He could already simulate what would happen if he said such a thing, and it would ultimately just be a waste of his time. Lionel waved a hand as Earth Force surged, forming a platform. He laid them on one by one. The latest _IP_SODIs are on _the website. James' gaze narrowed. The water force in the surroundings was so potent that it was hard to imagine anyone managing to gather up so much Earth force, let alone in such a short time. "Shouldn't you heal them?" James asked. "No. This is the perfect state for them. Take something I prepared for them. If I heal them now, all their hard work will be meaningless." James frowned when he heard this, but he didn't say anything as Lionel placed a hand over Alina's forehead. "Twinkling lily, Belle's blessing." A gentle chime began to resound. Whether by coincidence or maybe due to the strength of Lionel's spell, the dense clouds above instantly began to disperse as strong surges of light elemental force descended. From an injured state, Alina's cheeks suddenly became rosy and her breathing became even. In the blink of an eye, it was as though she hadn't fought a single battle all day. There was no doubt that, let alone James, this was the most powerful healing spell anyone present had ever seen in their lives. "Bring the injured to me. I'll heal them." Lionel didn't seem to be trying very hard, but his voice boomed across the battlefield. "Visit." For a better user experience after he finished speaking, he reached out a hand toward the energy shield of flesh and blood. Pure white vines coated in a cotton-like fabric shot out, sucking out the vitality of the blood one pint after another. "Please hold it up." Lionel spoke to James, who only gave him a nod in the end. Admiral Ellie watched with numbness as Lionel flipped the devastation on its head. He had used a few hours to heal tens of thousands, and he simply walked away with his brothers in tow as though it was nothing special at all. Of course, Lionel had relied on the large amounts of vitality the whale's flesh and blood had to accomplish this, but who else could do such a thing? The healers they had were quite talented, as one might expect from citizens of Earth, but even they couldn't hold Lionel's shoes in this regard. The difference was too shocking. "Admiral, we need to make a report." "Right." Admiral Ellie shook his head, looking at the wreckage of his cruiser and shaking his head. "The two princes are really something, Admiral? I heard that Prince Noah was the sole reason Unit 3 was able to survive." "Yes," Admiral Ellie said slowly, sighing as he looked up into the skies. "Visit." For the best no_underscore experience, were the days of his militaristic pride numbered? What happened to strength in numbers and the power of order and duty? What happened to following rank and dutifully fulfilling your orders? These days, all the battles seemed to whittle down to who had the largest fist, while those of them that were less talented found themselves in the role of cannon fodder. Shaking his head, Admiral Ellie went off to make his report. He had a feeling that things would only become more exaggerated in this way as time went on. He also felt that it probably wouldn't be long before they were on a battlefield even grander than this quite soon. James took a deep breath as he watched his former walk away. Walk was a strong word. The only 8 people Lionel hadn't healed were them. So, aside from Drake, Milan, Alan and Raj who could just barely shuffle their feet, Joel, Arnold, Gil and Franco were all being carried along by Lionel's Island of Earth force. It was all quite sobering. Of the 9 of them, the only one who had spoken to him was the one of them that should have hated him the most, Lionel. As for the other 8, they had met his gaze but hadn't said a word. James knew how important Lionel was to them and that a slight toward Lionel was just as great of a slight toward them. So, even though James knew that he had done his best to protect them during the metamorphosis, he also knew it wasn't enough. This is quite a lonely path, James thought to himself. He had already chosen family over friends. If he hadn't, he wouldn't have betrayed Lionel like he had. But, it was easy to put his head down and ignore the loneliness when no one was around him. He had ironically become the hard worker he never had been in school, giving him strength that dwarfed many of his acquaintances. And in exchange he lost his brothers. Visit for the best no_vil_8_ng experience. Chapter 10:11. Chapter 10:11 Stone. The groans resounded throughout the segmented cube to Lionel's laughter. He was quite used to his teammates groaning like this, but usually it was thanks to the expert hands of a beautiful masseuse. However, this time it was for something much less satisfying. And rather than groaning, it could be said that they were screaming. The bone-burning rose was truly working its magic, and because Lionel hadn't allowed them to heal even the smallest bit, the results they were gaining were excellent. As though that wasn't bad enough, Lionel had thrown them all into the 6th-dimensional cleansing waters at the same time. And, in a feat of true sadism, the bone-burning rose concoction that Lionel had given them had cleansing waters as part of the ingredients, making it feel as though their throats, stomachs and intestines were being burned from the inside out. Not only were the impurities of their bodies being weeded out one after another, but their foundations were being strengthened inch by inch. If Lionel wanted to help his brothers blaze through the 4th dimension, he didn't need to go through all these problems. After all, with the silver tablet he could loosen any bottlenecks they faced. However, Lionel knew that the silver tablet wouldn't be able to help them to the very end. After all, even now it had its limitations. For example, the amount of energy it took for Lionel to undo a bottleneck versus someone far less talented were vastly different. The less talented a person was, the more energy it would take. After a certain point, the effort put in wouldn't match up to the rewards gained if things continued like this. The latest _IP_SODs are on the website. Thus, the best course to take wasn't relying solely on the silver tablet, but rather instead combining its use with natural treasures that could keep their foundations firm and steady. Lionel had learned firsthand the benefit of patience and consolidation. After staying in the 3rd dimension for so long, his foundation had greatly benefited and his strength displayed that in spades. He wanted the same for his brothers, so they would have to experience a bit of pain first. After checking that their situations were stabilized, Lionel nodded to himself. Under lesser circumstances, the harsh reality was that his teammates would be in danger of dying. But, with all the equipment of the segmented cube, Lionel didn't feel the need to worry about this at all. There were too many fail-safes in place. It seems like Franco will gain the greatest benefits from this, but that makes sense. His ability is physical and he really pushed himself to the limits. He'll probably be the first to break into the 5th dimension. Lionel swept one more gaze before walking away and entering a different lab. The segmented cube had so much space now that Lionel hardly knew what to do with it all. The lab setting was more like several lab settings with technology from civilizations Lionel had never even heard of, let alone would understand how to use. He decided to keep things simple and stick with what he knew. Visit for the best no_vil_8_ng experience. Not long later, he found himself standing before the tentacle womb whose wounds were still slowly healing. Lionel had plans, but a lot of it would revolve around this tentacle beast, the koi fish and the segment cube working in tandem. However, currently, the tentacle womb was the weakest link. While it seemed like its abilities were astounding, when Lionel really thought about it, it wasn't all that impressive. Considering the resources he would need to pour into it, he might be better off just pouring it all into his crafts. It was easier to make, say, an automated machine gun. The worst part about the tentacle womb was that its energy consumption didn't stop at just its creations. After all, what it produced were living, breathing creatures. They would need to be fed and taken care for. Even though the segmented cube had more than enough room to accommodate such things, whether it was worth it was an entirely different question. Simply put, Using the tentacle womb to spam out weak creatures was a waste of time and resources. Just take the swordfish as an example. Lionel could create a gun and hundreds of bullets in less than an hour that could take out an entire school of them. The best part about this gun with his current skill is that it could be wielded by a human not even in the fifth dimension yet. When things were put into this frame, it could be said that the tentacle womb wasn't as groundbreaking as it seemed, nor was its ability particularly unique either. Just from a cursory thought, Lionel could already think of two people with semi-similar abilities to the tentacle womb. One was Hephaestus and his swallow ability. He was able to ingest creatures and make their abilities his own if he ate enough of them. A second was Simeon, who could genetically modify the ability of both people and creatures. The latest _IP_SODIs are on the website. If Lionel wanted to make this tentacle womb a trump card, it would have to be far stronger than it was now, and such a thing would take time and patience. However, he had a trump card in this regard, the silver tablet. If there was anything that could help this tentacle womb evolve, it was the silver tablet. The key to unlocking this path, though, would most definitely be the golden-scaled koi fish. A far distance away from the pressure cooker Earth was becoming a murderous aura hung, sinking deep into the walls of the office space. Richard sat at his desk, his hands clasped before him and his face expressionless. But the bulging veins on his forearms painted a completely different picture. It was clear that he was pissed off, and how couldn't he be? It had been 2 weeks since he met Aina in that odd state, and he had immediately guessed a few things. He had tested his conjectures on multiple occasions and concluded that he was about 90% correct, while the remaining 10% were miscellaneous details he would never grasp unless Aina herself told him. He took advantage of this opportunity to try and court Aina, but despite receiving no resistance from her father or her friends, he was stonewalled time and time again. The latest _stories are on website. Chapter 10-12. Chapter 10-12 Competition. Richard was a man who was very good at controlling his emotions. In fact, his patience had been displayed for a long while now. He had practically taken over what remained of the race to airship without lifting a single finger. In fact, now that he had Gradier's brother in his possession, it could be said that it was all over now. Gradier had been his only real competition, and he no longer dared to fight against him. However, those that saw him as a weak man now simply didn't understand just how infuriating the last 2 weeks had been. He had never experienced such a continuous and relentless assault on his ego. It was mind-numbing. At first, he had tried to be cautious and beat around the bush with Aina, but then she had caught him completely off guard. "Are you trying to court me?" Aina stood in her courtyard, a faint sheen of sweat on her face. She had learned modesty during the past few days and now dressed in a new flexible armor. According to her, modesty was important for a woman, but not to the point where she should hide her beauty completely. Surprisingly, this was a conclusion she had come to without either Savon or Yuri saying so explicitly. However, Yuri still felt that she took some responsibility in catalyzing this due to how she had covered Aina's body previously. This experience made her realize that even the smallest push could lead Aina in a particular direction. It made her hesitant as to whether she should take action or not. The latest _IP_SODIs are on the website. Now, she could only watch as Richard visited daily, as though trying to imprint himself onto her mind. Without a choice, Yuri could only drag Aina out of the estate to experience the world. If all she knew was this small corner, her awakened personality would be far too negatively affected, or it might never reawaken at all. Still, even Yuri almost choked on her drink when she heard Aina's words, let alone Richard. However, Richard, who felt he had an understanding of Aina, regained his composure quickly. Previously, he had put Aina into one of two categories. She was either a block of ice that could be easily convinced to marry him, or she was a block of ice that would never marry anyone. Such cold beauties were the kind that were either logical to a fault or stubborn to a fault. In the time he had known Aina, it had seemed like she was the latter and couldn't be budged from her position. But, now that this change had occurred, and even the fact she was being so straightforward, made it seem like she had now somehow transitioned to becoming the former. "Indeed," Richard said confidently. "I am the heir apparent of the Viola family, and all of this will soon be mine. I would, of course, need a wife of your caliber by my side." The Viola family? Isn't that just a sixth-dimensional family? If Richard was a lesser man, his facial expression would have already warped at these words alone. What the hell did just sixth-dimensional mean? Did she understand what such a family represented? Visit. For a better user experience, what Richard didn't know was that Aina did, and she felt like Richard had a cap on his potential. Richard would be shackled by his sixth-dimensional lineage factors, but Lionel had been born with a seventh-dimensional lineage factor. The difference was large. Luckily, Aina had learned in her lesson on modesty that thinking out loud wasn't a good thing either, so she hadn't said this. But she also wasn't quite good at filtering what she should and shouldn't say either. Something that would become very apparent to Richard very soon. Yes. My Viola family sits at the very top of sixth-dimensional families and can be considered to be a hair's breadth away from the seventh. What we're lacking is a generation of talent that can lead us to leap over this final hurdle. This is a task we can take on together. I see, that is a decent argument. Aina nodded. After all, building something on your own will be more reliable than relying on others, especially with how important lineage is. I can be considered single right now, I think, so I can allow you to court me. Richard's internal frown disappeared when he heard this and a light smile spread across his face. But, though I'm single right now and he might be very angry with me according to my calculations because I held on to this, there is still a chance between us. Aina spoke, looking down at a broken bracelet she couldn't stand to take off of her wrist for some reason. So, it could be said that you are in competition with my ex-boyfriend. Richard almost choked on air. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. This cold woman had an ex-boyfriend? What the hell kind of nonsense was this? That was when he remembered a conclusion he had made himself long ago. The only way to break into the heart of such a cold woman was by knowing her from a young age. Thinking of this, he relaxed. A childhood friend might have an advantage, but women usually became more realistic as they grew older. With Aina acting like this, it was clear that he wasn't so difficult to erase. Richard looked at the bracelet Aina had pointed out. A broken fourth-dimensional treasure? How pathetic. If this is my competition, this will be easy. Famous last words like these had never been spoken before. If it's a competition, I believe it's proper to let you know what the parameters are, correct? I can only tell you that you are far behind. Even setting aside talent for a moment, there is value in being attracted to your husband, as this would represent strong genes for rearing children. But you are shorter than my ex-boyfriend by half a foot and are even an inch or two shorter than myself. Your shoulders aren't as broad, your skin isn't as healthy, and your eyes aren't as pretty. Your hands are smaller, your smile isn't as appealing, and judging by the silhouette of your robes pressing against your lower body, Aina looked down toward Richard's crotch and shook her head. Visit. For the best no_underscreen_undersing experience, I believe commenting on that would be inappropriate, so I will refrain. Aina's oh-so-kind words had nearly turned Richard blue. Chapter 1013. Chapter 1013. Coming when Richard had left that day for the first time in a long time, he almost wanted to destroy everything around him. It had taken all of his self-control to leave that place with a calm smile and a nod, maintaining his image as a noble young man. But being told that he was inadequate in the face of the woman he was courting was enough to make several of his blood vessels pop and snap. Richard regretted wearing the latest fashion trends now. Much like Earth, there was a certain appeal women across the dimensional verse got from looking at the silhouette of a man's lower body. For Lionel, who liked to wear sweatpants so much, Aina had seen it many times before and had quite liked it even though she never voiced it aloud. Richard's robes worked much the same way and were even designed to accentuate that portion of his body both subtly and aesthetically. And yet, without so much as a filter, Aina had pointed it out without reserve or holding back. No, she had been polite enough not to say it so clearly. He was so grateful for her grace. Damn it. He had almost wanted to say that he was a grower and not a shower, but he knew whatever last bit of face he had left would have been completely destroyed the moment he said anything to that effect. The more he thought about it, the more infuriated he became. As though that much wasn't bad enough, after displaying her grace, Aina had gone on to point out several other things, saying that his jaw wasn't as sharp, that his voice wasn't as deep. She had even said that his butt wasn't as round. Yet, he had had to stand there and take it from start to finish. Visit. For the best no_underscreen experience, it took Richard several days to calm himself, but he had returned every day to hear Aina's scrutiny, only to come back to his estate more and more dejected. He should have been entering the happiest phase of his life, but instead he was having his ego stamp down one polite insult after another. He was so caught off guard by these things that he hadn't even registered that Aina said that her ex-boyfriend was more talented than he was, too wrapped up in the other more deliberate blows to his ego. Richard forgot all the ridiculous tricks he had used to try to get Aina to change her mind, but the ending of each was more painful than the last. There's something to be said about just feeling good and doing what's right in the moment, right? I believe that everyone should be free. Richard spoke with a light smile. Feeling good is an easy way to get swept up in indulgence. Aina replied. Plus, such talk of freedom would only work if I was a man. My reproductive burden is higher than yours, and it will also make it more difficult for me to find an appropriate husband should I indulge due to the widely accepted societal norms. In addition to this, a woman feeling good isn't necessary for copulation and birthing the next generation. It is only an added bonus and is not as important as other things. It will be the last thing I consider. This is a good thing for you though. It would be impossible for you to make me feel better than him. Richard left that day almost coughing up blood. Visit. For the best understanding experience, what do you like in a man? Richard asked. I like a man who can take charge and protect me. Unfortunately, you lost points in this aspect by sending me on a dangerous mission you didn't want to do yourself. You are too cunning and too scholarly. You have no edge to you and you lack a kingly air. You would rather be on the back line of a battlefield than on the front line, and that's not very attractive. However, that doesn't mean you don't have redeeming qualities. After all, I love to battle. So, if I have your child, you can stay home to rear and guide them while I fight. I can give you half a mark for that. He tried everything, but nothing seemed to move her in the slightest. In fact, it only buried him into a deeper and deeper hole. By now, it had been half a month of this, and it only seemed to get worse every day. By this point, whatever attraction he had for Aina had whittled down to a pure and condensed rage, as though he would sooner stab her through the heart than walk down an aisle with her. Richard's hands clasped together hard over his desk as he slowly attempted to regain his bearings. He took deep breaths, causing the vibrations of the room to cool down bit by bit. Right then there was a knock at the door. He looked up and unclenched his fingers, patting down whatever wrinkles might have appeared on his robes. Come in. Visit. For the best understanding experience, Richard was expecting a normal servant, but what he actually saw left his pupils constricted into pinholes. A skinny middle-aged man no thicker than a broom's pole entered with light steps. He had a thick mustache on his upper lip and aftershave covering the rest of his face in a thin shadow. His head, though, was completely bald. Richard recognized this man immediately and shot up to his feet. He was none other than the current head of the oldest vassal family their Viola family had, and was probably the most trusted aide of the current family head, Vassal O'Brien. Vassal O'Brien, please forgive this junior for his rudeness. Vassal O'Brien looked Richard up and down before chuckling. No need to be so stiff, young one. I've come with good news. Richard's heart sped up. Was it that time already? Would he be officially appointed? They're coming. These words weren't what Richard wanted to hear the most, but it could be said they were most definitely the second thing he wanted to hear the most. They had known for a long time that Miguel had purposely held back from entering the sixth dimension and that he had a purpose for doing so. It seemed like it was time. The latest _SODIs are on the website. This is an opportunity, one that no one would want to give up. They'll see how she escapes from my palm now. Chapter 1014. Chapter 1014. Pure neutral force. Lionel's palm flipped over, revealing a snow globe. Within, the half-dead body of Monkey, the third savant, lay. A sort of internal struggle took hold of him, but he eventually shook his head. Little Blackstar still hasn't woken up yet? This is a decision he'll be forced to make later. Shaking his head, Lionel pushed this thought away. He knew that there would be a lot of tough decisions he had to make on his road into the future, and he had to be mentally prepared to make them. For now, though, he still had time to think about this one. Instead, he focused on the less morally existential issues. Energy purification will make things much easier on me. Energy purification was exactly what it sounded like. It was the process of cleansing force into a higher form. This pure force was not only easier to absorb, it was marginally more powerful than force of normal kind. Visit. For a better user experience to understand how this worked, one needed to understand how force worked normally. After a metamorphosis descended, physics would gain a new law not present within the third dimension, and those new laws would revolve around force. This new law was why Lionel had gotten so lost in the weeds when he was comprehending his first offensive technique back in the Joan Zone. When Lionel learned more about the dimensional verse, he eventually allowed these overly complicated and verbose explanations fall into the background. He used his understanding of these intricacies to understand the nuances of techniques, but it was no longer at the forefront of his mind. What was key to understand was only that in addition to atoms, force also made up the existence of everything. Everything in existence beyond the third dimension had force attached to it, and the characteristics of this force was what changed the fundamental laws that governed the world. This truth was why the concentration of water force was so great on the ocean and why James was so shocked that Lionel was able to gather up earth force so quickly in a region it shouldn't have been so easy. However, it was exactly this that made most force impure. The fact Lionel could gather up so much earth force in an environment that wasn't conducive to it at all spoke volumes. Often, in nature, it was impossible to find a single pure force of a singular kind without influence of other force. Just taking the ocean as a continued example, were there not countless particulates that made up its being? Setting aside the most obvious in salt, there was oxygen content within water, countless other gases, and that didn't even mention the numerous microscopic organisms. Visit. For a better user experience, this was all to say that there was never any true pure force, and this was exactly why neutral force was the most abundant of any kind. This was because neutral force represented the amalgamation and balance of countless different forces into one. The natural inclination of force was to amalgamate and enter this balanced form, and it took effort, affinity and power to separate this neutral force into its individual parts. And this was where the abilities of the golden scale koi fish truly began to shine. Not only could it separate out neutral force into its individual parts, but it was also capable of producing pure neutral force, the pinnacle force that all force tended toward. The individual parts of neutral force were easy enough to understand, but pure neutral force was a somewhat novel concept, but it didn't take much explanation to grasp either. While all force tended toward fusion, there would, of course, be less stable and less perfect fusions. These forms of neutral force were everywhere, they had reached a good enough balance, but there would definitely be clashes within its structure that would lower its power. This imperfect neutral force could be akin to regular gas at a gas station, while pure neutral force could be akin to premium gas. The gold koi fish was able to gather up this force and help it to enter a perfectly balanced state. This was the shocking ability of its energy purification. But why was this useful? What good was this pure neutral force? The latest _IP_SODIs are on the website. The answer to that was simple. Pure neutral force went further in the energy it could produce. A single unit of impure neutral force was worth maybe 1/100th of pure neutral force, and that was at the lowest third dimension. The higher the dimension, the wider the gap became, because the formation of pure neutral force also became more difficult. In addition to this, the energy that invalids released upon their deaths was actually a form of neutral force, a step above impure neutral force but a step below pure neutral force. It had already been seen by Lionel long ago that this force was able to loosen and undo bottlenecks one might experience in the future. So just how much better would pure neutral force be at this? In truth, Lionel knew the answer to this, because pure neutral force was exactly what the Puppet Master variant invalid had released upon its death. Thanks to that single variant invalid and single absorption of pure neutral force, Lionel's bottlenecks in his metal body had loosened by 3 or 4 stages. By now, the prowess of the little koi fish should be obvious. If pure neutral force was worth so much more, and this little one was actually able to produce 5th-dimensional pure neutral force, then wouldn't that cut down the amount of force Lionel needed to awaken his former army? Rather than allowing the silver tablet to absorb the force directly, why not allow the koi fish to do so instead? Upon creating the pure neutral force, Lionel would allow the silver tablet to absorb it, and the benefits would be even greater. On top of this, this was the high-level force that the silver tablet needed to awaken Norman's former fiancée, the very young woman whose blood had fed and awakened the silver tablet to begin with. Objectively, when it came to undoing bottlenecks, the silver tablet was better than even pure neutral force was. But, if the abilities of the koi fish and the silver tablet were synergized, just what kind of impact would that have? Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, the best part was that this was just the tip of the iceberg. To now, Lionel had only been following a single train of thought, one that followed the benefits of pure neutral force. However, what he hadn't yet touched upon was the opposite path. Just what were the benefits of the dissection of neutral force to form other pure forces? Chapter 10:15. Chapter 10:15 Pure Force. The path of pure force was what Lionel might have been the most excited about, and it was also the path he believed just might be the way to making this tentacle womb more useful to him. As one might expect, pure force was most definitely linked to pure force crystals. Only with pure force could pure force crystals be formed. This was why Lionel had originally thought that the koi fish would be useless to him. Why keep around a creature he would have to feed and raise, not mention worry about its betrayal, if he had a perfectly fine and loyal machine that could do the same exact thing? It didn't make sense. The koi fish had already exposed itself to have intelligence no less than that of a human. Though it couldn't communicate with Lionel, Lionel didn't believe it didn't have the ability to. If it could put him in an illusion, then it could most definitely convey its thoughts through said illusion. Without appropriate benefits, Lionel wouldn't keep such a dangerous thing around. But Lionel had been wrong. The segmented cube was much like the silver tablet. Its ultimate function was better than the koi fish alone, but what it put out was dependent on what went in. The latest _IP_SODIs are on the website. The silver tablet could produce an energy that seemed to be even above pure neutral force, while the segmented cube could produce force and pure force crystals. However, it was still all dependent on what they took in. The silver tablet needed to absorb the relative pure neutral force of invalids, while the segmented cube needed force-dense environments of a certain level or caliber. Due to this, the koi fish essentially became a branching point that allowed both objects to display their true abilities with far less drawbacks. This was where the first ability of this path came into play. The koi fish would allow Lionel to form pure force crystals much faster and with much greater ease. It had already been over a month since he learned of the segmented cube's ability and had even gone to the energy-dense region of planet Solara, yet he had yet to form even a single one. Clearly this wasn't as easy as it seemed to be. With the koi fish though, so long as Lionel gave it some time, this would be a matter of ease. Very soon he would gain the force crystals he needed. And once he found the perfect light elemental force to replace his snow force, he would then be able to upgrade his snowy star owl lineage factor, relying on the force arts displayed by the pure force crystals. However, this was just the beginning. Why were pure force crystals so valuable? It was because they could do the same thing pure neutral force could do in loosening bottlenecks, but it was far more targeted. When pure neutral force is taken into the body, it cleared away impurities and cleanses one's foundation. This lays stronger groundwork to take the next step forward, and it works this way for everyone regardless of their affinities. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, however, pure force in general is usually tied to a particular ability or a particular lineage factor. The root of these powers comes from pure force. So, when one absorbs pure force rather than increasing one's overall foundation in a general sense, pure force targets what it is familiar with and bolsters this instead. Take Supreme Monet for example. She has an elemental ability and it falls under the unique elemental category. It had to be remembered that the three forms of elemental ability were either unique in that it gave a special ability, neutral in that it gave general control over elements, or evolutionary in that it allowed Onto to improve the element into higher and higher forms. Supreme Monet could use her flames to heal herself, not much unlike a phoenix, so she falls under the unique category. Under normal circumstances, there are only a few ways for Supreme Monet to increase the strength of her ability. She could swallow a beast crystal, she could be patient and wait for it to mature through her training, she could increase her dimension, and finally she could wait for her home world to increase dimensions as well. These latter three options all took time and patience, while the very first option was a crapshoot. There was a very low probability of a beast crystal taking effect, and it might cause a varied mutation that wouldn't be exactly what you were looking for. However, pure force crystals were different. Not only did they take near immediate effect, but there was no unpredictability factor. It would work 100% of the time and it wouldn't mutate your ability, it would only allow it to progress along its design path. Visit. For a better user experience by now, what Lionel wanted to do was obvious then. All he needed to do was understand the underlying pure force that governed this tentacle womb's ability. Then he would use the koi fish to create and feed the tentacle womb these pure force crystals. Over time, the tentacle womb would eventually strengthen to the point investing in its reproduction was worth it for Lionel. It only took a few questions from the dictionary for Lionel to understand exactly what the tentacle womb needed to evolve. Life force and blood force had already been guessed by me, so this much was obvious. I can probably gather up the two forces just from killing beasts, since he'll have to do that anyway. But this third force? What is breaking force? Lionel was intrigued. This simple matter had seemingly become complicated once again. This so-called breaking force was something Lionel had never come across before, nor had he expected it to be so fundamental to how the tentacle womb functioned. Interesting. Lionel suddenly felt he had stepped into a new world. This breaking force, the tentacle womb only needed a small portion of it, only a single crystal for every 1,000 life and blood pure crystal it consumed, and yet, it was the core part of its ability. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, is it really above life force? Just as Lionel was thinking about this, a wailing siren reached his ears. This was definitely something new, as he had no idea what it meant, but he had a good guess. Was Earth being attacked again? Chapter 1016. Chapter 1016. Cold. Lionel frowned lightly and turned. With quick steps he made it to the pool he kept the koi fish in. Almost immediately the fish jetted away, trying to get as far from Lionel as possible. However, its efforts were meaningless. It didn't have a strong body to begin with, and the only thing it could do with the energy it purified was inhale and exhale it. It didn't seem possible for it to use it personally. With a wave of his hand, Lionel brought the koi fish out in a globule of cleansing waters and faced it. "You like these waters, right? They're the best waters you've ever swam in?" Lionel felt a bit ridiculous talking to a fish, but he didn't patronize it nor did he dumb down his tone of voice. Instead, he laced his dream force in with his words, conveying an intent with their subtleties. With this koi fish's force affinity, it should be able to understand Lionel very clearly. The koi fish released an air bubble that looked a bit adorable in Lionel's direction. But when the soul force waves reached Lionel, his lips twitched. "This little bastard just spit at me?" Visit. For a better user experience, Lionel wasn't sure whether he should be angry or if he should be laughing. It was so abnormal that he really wanted to do both. Clearly, this not-so-little fish didn't want to admit how much it enjoyed swimming in cleansing waters. Just from a couple weeks, it felt like it had been reborn. Its abilities even worked much faster and better than it ever had in the past. On top of that, cleansing waters was the best medium for force transfer it had ever come across. Normally, when it was stuck in water, it had to divert a bit of its energy toward creating a cleansing halo around it. This was why when Lionel first met it, it looked like it had a spotlight on it. However, this took a lot of preparation and slowed down its efficiency in gathering up and converting energy by more than half. The cleansing waters fixed all of this with ease. Plus, it wasn't salty like the ocean it hated so much. Could be said that the koi fish was a clean freak. It had been worried about where Lionel would put it earlier, but it felt at ease now. That said, it would never admit that to Lionel. The koi fish obviously disliked humans, or else it wouldn't have done what it had done. Though, it could be said that it also disliked invalids as well for clogging up its waters and always coming after it. "So you don't want to admit that you like this water, huh?" Lionel smiled lightly. "Okay, I'll put you back in the ocean then." The golden-scaled koi fish suddenly panicked, wiggling about the waters. It looked quite beautiful, its fins floating about like silk fabrics. Visit. For a better user experience. "Oh, so you want to stay then?" Another bubble. Lionel grinned, but it was quite cold to the point the koi fish trembled beside itself. "Do you know how many people your actions killed? Do you know how many mothers will go without sons now? How many fathers will go without daughters? On my battlefield alone, there were almost 50,000 individuals defending a stretch of a couple dozen kilometers. Now there's barely 40,000 remaining and all their deaths are on your head." The koi fish stood frozen in the globe of water, suddenly feeling suffocated. Fish needed to move to be able to breathe, but no matter how hard the koi fish tried, it couldn't loosen itself from Lionel's death stare. "Did you think that just because you look beautiful, that just because you seem innocent enough, that I would be fooled? To me, you're a mass murderer that deserves death no less than if it was a human standing before me now. The only reason I haven't killed you is because my partner is in a coma and I can't extract your ability. However, I promise you, if you don't cooperate, if you don't make yourself seem useful, if you can't give me a reason not to kill you and put your ability within something else more beneficial to me in a year from now, he'll give you the most horrible death you can imagine. Do you understand me?" The latest _AP_SOTIs are on _the website. Lionel was inwardly furious at the audacity of this koi fish. If it was before he had made his resolve to become a king, he would have long since slaughtered this koi fish and its companion. However, now he felt like he had to make choices that were a bit beyond the scope of his own moral compass. Objectively speaking, the koi fish would save more lives under Lionel's control than it had ever taken. This was the cold logic of it all, so it was the choice Lionel had chosen to make this time. However, Lionel didn't have a beast control ability, nor did he have anyone he trusted enough to hand over these responsibilities to. So, if this koi fish didn't cooperate, he wouldn't hesitate to toss it into a snow globe and kill it once little Black Star awoke. The fear of the koi fish was palpable, but it still forced itself to nod. Though it couldn't understand the intricacies of Lionel's words, it understood the gist of it enough to understand what would happen to it if it didn't cooperate. Ultimately, it was still willing to do what it had to do to survive. "Good," Lionel said coldly. With emotion, Lionel took out a familiar vial. This was none other than the ocean drop vial that Kira had given him. But it had been modified by Lionel a bit. Of course, if others knew that Lionel was modifying a silver-grade treasure as a bronze crafter, there would likely be an uproar. But Lionel himself didn't find it to be that big of a deal. Lionel hung the ocean drop vial around his neck after siphoning large amounts of cleansing waters into it. Then he transferred the golden scaled koi fish into the necklace vial. The latest _IP_SODIs are on the website. After he did this, he also transferred the silver tablet before dropping in the ores he would use to refine his metal body. Purify the essence of these ores and transfer them to me after you are done. After issuing this command, Lionel shot off toward where his brothers were resting. Chapter 10:17. Chapter 10:17. When it came to refining his metal body, the koi fish was also a godsend. The essence of ores could also be considered a type of force, a variation on earth force. So, it could of course be multiplied as well. This came with many benefits. Lionel would be able to use less ores to temper his body to the same level. His bottlenecks would also become thinner now that he had less impurities to worry about. It would even be possible to create stronger ores or starter veins with the koi fish's abilities. The possible applications for the koi fish seemed endless. It was no surprise it took so many units to duplicate it. Not long afterward, Lionel made it to the residential units. He had planned to let everyone choose whatever rooms they wanted. But, since they had been dealing with the pain of the bone-burning rose until recently, they had mostly chosen to stay together. By the end of it, they ended up sprawled all over a patch of greenery and had been asleep for 3 days already. Lionel jogged into the garden to find them still lying there. Seeing their ridiculous states, he couldn't help but shake his head and chuckle. Suddenly, Lionel released a loud clap. "Wake up." What the hell? Fuck. I was in the middle of at least 3 beauties. In your dreams. Visit. For the best no understanding experience, it was my dreams. Lionel grinned. One after another, strong auras standing firmly within the 5th dimension began to blossom forth. It was a fantastic enough sight for Lionel to ignore the terrible smell that was coming from them for just a moment. Truthfully, Lionel was pleasantly surprised. Though they weren't exactly far from the 5th dimension to begin with, Lionel still thought it would have taken at least a month or 2. It's probably the influence of Earth. Coming from a talented world really has such a large benefit. It's unfortunate, though. I also wanted to get them to practice dimensional cleanse, too, but there's no time right now. Alright. Lionel finally put an end to the commotion. There's a war about to start soon, you guys need to get ready. War? Raj looked up from his comfortable spot in the grass with confusion. He seemed to have lost at least 50 pounds, but he was still a large mound of fat. It could only be said that he was still enormous. Why haven't I heard anything? Of course they hadn't heard anything. The segmented cube was perfect at isolating sound. The only reason why Lionel knew is because his internal sight was paying attention to the outside world. Plus, in the last 2 weeks he had been doing a lot of stuff on the outside world, whether that be preparing his shop or fulfilling his promise to the Dove siblings. So, he had no choice but to pay attention to the outside world anyway. One might argue that Lionel should be depressed that his store wouldn't be making as much money anymore, but was that even true? Now that there was a war, he could shake his grandfather down for some real funds. There was no better force crafter on Earth right now than himself. If the Ascension Army wanted his help, they would, of course, have to pay. After a brief explanation, Lionel kicked them all toward getting cleaned up. Barely 10 minutes later, they all stood spirited, their gazes glowing with battle intent. It seemed like they all wanted to take down the world together. I don't really know what's going on in the outside world right now, but we'll stick together as an elite squadron. This time I won't go ahead on my own. Probably. Lionel touched his nose. Visit. For a better user experience, at least tell us you brought back some goodies. Franco rubbed his hands together. I did. Lionel smiled. For some of you anyway. Franco's expression sank before he suddenly caught an enormous beast crystal Lionel threw at him. I happened to find one perfect for you. This one came from a beaver, but its physical strength was ridiculous. It should help to strengthen your muscle fibers to a next level. And for Gil? Lionel tossed over a beast crystal swirling with crimson lightning. I haven't really found anything good enough for the rest of you. But what I do have are treasures. A halberd for Joel, a pair of gloves for Arnold. One after another, Lionel handed them perfectly tailored treasures, all of which were Tier 7 bronze crafts. They had no idea that Lionel's skill had already reached such a level. Raj sniffled. I always knew that Cap was the best. Give me a hug. Lionel dodged out of the way of Raj's fat rolls, a clear sign of laughter on his face. The borders of Earth's fold of reality suddenly found themselves surrounded as it slowly stretched to its limits. Having swallowed up several solar systems, what was once Earth had gone from a single planet to countless light-years of territory. After thorough investigation, there was no one who wasn't aware of Earth's greatest weakness: population. Having suddenly gained so much territory, it was simply impossible for Earth to defend it all. This was the best chance they would have to claim the talent of a future eighth-dimensional world for themselves. Visit. For the best understanding experience among these individuals, there were many that were more than just a little familiar, many that Lionel had fought not too long ago, including the Midas and Radix family. However, if one thought that was the end of it, they would be sorely mistaken. The greed that such soon-to-be fertile lands represented was simply too much for anyone to give up. It was amidst this chaos that Alther sent Lionel a message. Imperial Father, the expansion of our fold of reality has reached a critical point. If they take advantage of this to send sixth-dimensional existences in. Galerin finished giving his report to Emperor Fox. However, what he hadn't expected was for his father to uncaringly continue meditating after speaking a few careless words. They want. Emperor Fox said casually, not opening his eyes. What? Galerin asked. Because they're cowards. Emperor Fox said lightly. Galerin blinked but didn't quite understand how to respond to this. Should we move out the elite troops? No. Emperor Fox replied. But, Imperial Father, they'll be overmatched. So what? Just sick my grandsons at them. What the hell did I birth them for if not this? Visit. For the best no_understand experience Galerin, just 2 chapters today. Chapter 1018. Chapter 1018 Forget, Leo. A beauty jumped into Lionel's arms under the astonished gazes of his teammates. She was gorgeous to an extreme and had a mature charm that women their age hadn't quite refined yet. On top of that, she had a sort of queenly air most women would never birth. And yet, the moment she saw Lionel, she sprung into his arms as though she had always meant to be there. What the fuck? And to think I actually felt bad for this bastard. Cap's been holding out on us. Gil felt like he had been betrayed. Lionel laughed and hugged Mordred back. It had been a long time since he had seen her and it seemed that she was living life well. At least, her relationship with her father and mother seemed far better now than it had been in the past. After Mordred practically squeezed Lionel to death, she pulled back and pinched his cheeks with both hands. You brat, you just left us for years and disappeared. Where's little Aina? I need to see if you've bullied her while she didn't have me to protect her. Seeing the shift from love affair to brother-sister doting, Lionel's brothers practically got whiplash. However, Gil's perverted mind worked very differently. Visit. For the best no_understand experience, so Cap has this kind of submissive little brother fetish, huh? What a scandal. Lionel touched his nose when he heard Mordred's question before coughing lightly. About that. She isn't here right now. Mordred raised an eyebrow and looked toward Lionel deeply. She had a unique perspective on the relationship between Aina and Lionel because she had been there at its infancy. If she had to be honest, she felt that this sort of crossroads between them was inevitable because their foundation was far too shaky. Lionel had never been able to address all of Aina's insecurities, not because he wasn't good enough, but because there were some forms of confidence that one could only give themselves. On the other hand, Lionel himself was too good at detaching himself. Though he was good at reading people, he had blinders on when it came to himself and those close to him. In some ways, Mordred felt that Lionel put these blinders up as a self-protective mechanism. He subconsciously knew that it wasn't right to treat his friends and woman like they were numbers on a screen to be dissected. As such, he purposely ignored a lot of things. In much the same way someone who could read minds wouldn't want those around them aware of such a thing for fear of making them uncomfortable, in a lot of ways Lionel was like this. It was yet another layer to the facade that was him. However, Mordred wasn't quite certain of who the real Lionel was, or if it was even a good idea for this version of Lionel to be the one who presented himself to the world. That hidden Lionel felt more dangerous than she had ever been, and Mordred felt that Aina was the balance to him. Visit. For the best no_understand experience, it was such a fragile and immature balance that could collapse at any time. At least for now, it seemed that Lionel still felt that the relationship was mendable as he hadn't had a fierce reaction to Mordred's words. However, she could also feel that this tipping point wasn't very far away. If something went wrong, all right, in that case I can let you off the hook a bit. But only a bit. Mordred replied. Lionel suddenly grinned. Really? But I come bearing gifts. Lionel took out the beast crystal he got from the Black Swan. The moment it appeared, it radiated a powerful aura of darkness that attracted Mordred instantly. Mordred's eyes twinkled, grasping the beast crystal with both hands. Not bad, not bad. I guess Big Sis can forgive you. Mordred giggled beside herself. Where's my gift? The sudden voice came from deep within the throne room. Lionel had come to Avalon for the sake of taking hold of the vanguard. Since King Arthur was still only a secretary marquis, he wasn't able to take command of an army on his own as only Governor Dukes could do so. The latest _sodes are on the website. Originally, Lionel had thought it would just be him and his brothers, but now it seemed he would have King Arthur at his back. This would work excellently for them both. Mordred and Arthur both were very competent generals and wouldn't need Lionel's constant support. This would allow Lionel and his brothers freedom while being able to rely on a backbone. It would definitely be a lethal combination. At this moment, the group stood within a hallway of Camelot's castle, though it couldn't really be considered a castle any longer and was much more like a modern estate. The whole of Avalon had been modernized and the remnants of royalty had been expunged. The so-called throne room was just no longer this and was just a meeting place they should have been headed to. But Lionel had gotten distracted reuniting with Mordred and forgotten this. Unsurprisingly, the voice was from Arthur, who accompanied by Guinevere and Lancelot both. In fact, there were other knights of the Round Table present, but many of them weren't the original members that Lionel had become used to. Obviously, new talents had risen up in the time Lionel had been away. With the new system of the Ascension Empire, the talents that Camelot had mostly neglected in the past due to their poor backgrounds were rising up one after another. And as citizens of Earth, they were all extremely talented as well. Lionel laughed. I didn't manage to find anything you. But if you still need help with your streaking problem, I might be able to do something to help. Arthur, who had come with kind intentions, suddenly faltered. He had gone through great pains to ignore the fact his bare ass had been bared for all his citizens to see during the war just 4 years ago, all for Lionel to pick at this scab the moment he appeared. The latest _sodes are on the website. Forget I asked for anything? Arthur grumbled. An eruption of laughter followed his words. Chapter 1019. Chapter 1019. Order. After pleasantries, the group got to business quickly. They were all aware that they were under the command of Lionel, but it was ironically Lionel who knew the least about what was going on right this moment. So, he listened patiently as things were explained to him by Arthur. A star map was laid out on a large wooden table. It had a faint holographic character to it. Every time Lionel's eyes refocused, he would find a new layer to observe. It was definitely a clever piece of technology that left him a bit intrigued. The situation is getting more complicated with each passing moment, but we believe that we have a good grasp on where the borders of our fold of reality will stop. It will be defined as such. Arthur pressed a finger down and the star map changed. The instant the borders became defined, Lionel's dreamscape went haywire, his pupils constricting. A bit of his aura leaked, causing the atmosphere to shift. Arthur looked up from the map toward Lionel, his pupils also constricted. He couldn't fathom just how powerful Lionel had become in just a few years. He felt like a completely different monster. Is something wrong, Lionel? Arthur asked. Lionel narrowed his eyes and didn't respond immediately. But he soon calmed and exhaled a breath. The latest _sodes are on the website. It's not important for now, you can continue. Sorry about that. Arthur paused for a moment before nodding. Since Lionel had said so, there was no point in pressing him. Since he would be taking charge of this anyway, Arthur had confidence that Ryu would definitely put them in the best position to win. After all, it was thanks to his contribution that they had dealt with White City alone, something that gave them more than enough leverage to negotiate with the Ascension Empire. Thanks to that, they were able to maintain a semblance of autonomy today. With the borders defined how they are now, as it's been explained to me, it isn't quite necessary to panic despite the large area we now have to cover, mostly because of 2 matters of importance: habitable worlds and suppression. Starting with the latter, it has to be remembered that these are people coming into our world, a 5th-dimensional fold of reality. This makes it near impossible for 6th-dimensional existences to appear. At the same time, our world has matured. Previously, we were attacked the moment we stepped into the 4th dimension and had yet to form our teeth. But now that Earth is in the 5th dimension and has matured greatly, those who invade our lands will experience proper suppression. It will be more difficult for them to use force and also more difficult for them to replenish their force. This aside, there is the matter of habitable worlds. Even though Earth's fold of reality was expanding and the planets within it were gaining massive benefits as a result, that didn't mean those benefits would be immediate, nor did it mean that all of these planets would become habitable. In just Earth's main solar system alone, only Earth, the Moon and Avalon were habitable. The remainder of the planets either could not sustain proper life and were useless, or could not sustain proper life and were slowly becoming disaster worlds. Visit. For a better user experience of these planet, Venus and Neptune both were becoming disaster worlds while the remainder showed no signs of becoming useful. Only Mars seemed to show a small bit of potential in maybe becoming another habitable planet, but that would take several years to come to fruition. This was all to say that what these invaders needed was a foothold. Without a foothold, what good was it to claim a piece of Earth's fold of reality for themselves? They were all just waiting for the perfect moment, just before Earth's fold of reality boundaries solidified, to pierce through. Luckily, these habitable planets were rare. And not only were they rare, but there were levels of desirability among them. For example, take Earth and the Moon. As evolved as the Moon had become, no one would choose the Moon over Earth as a desirable location. We have reason to believe that the first wave will be those with true ambitions toward what is rightfully ours. As such, we've divided the planets into 3 orders of desirability, order A, B and C, with C being the least. Our fold of reality will cover about 1/100th the size of the Milky Way when it is finished. There are about 43 habitable planets in this range. 29 are C order. 12 are B order and 2 are order. We've been tasked with defending one of the order habitable planets and also setting up a small-scale civilization there. This order planet has been designated the name Earth X1. For reference, the B order planets will be designated starting with the Moon X1, while the C order planets will follow after Avalon X1. Lionel nodded. He remembered Aina explaining to him how this naming nomenclature worked. X designated that this planet was in the same dimension as Earth, while 1 designated that it was the first world outside of Earth to earn this title. The second order planet was probably named Earth X2. Visit. For a better user experience, Lionel didn't have a problem with this, but the others were shocked. There were 9 governor dukes, 2 grand prime ministers, and yet it was them tasked with guarding Earth X1? Why did this seem too ridiculous? Shouldn't they be guarding a B-order planet instead? That seemed to make more sense. Lionel, however, understood that this was just his grandfather being his grandfather again. In Earth's first defense against the wider dimensional verse, how could 2 Fox not take the helm? Finally, we have the reports on the potential threats. Lionel rose from his seat after Arthur was finished. He stretched slightly, a confident air hanging around him. I assume that the teleportation platforms have already been prepared? How many people can move out at once? A single trip can take about 100. Arthur said with a sigh. This really wasn't enough. If they were too slow, by the time they got there, instead of being the defending party, they'd be forced into the attacking position. They'll stabilize this side, then head over first. I should be able to improve on that number. Lionel grinned. Visit. For the best no_underscored_undersing experience, Lionel suddenly felt his hands itching. This war was an opportunity calling out to him. He had a feeling that what he gained from these battles would make or break the next 10 years for him. Chapter 1020? Chapter 1020 Earth X1. If Earth X1 were to be described in a single word, it would be wet. It felt like a light drizzle was perpetually falling from the skies, and the thick canopy of rainforests were so wide-ranging that it felt that every piece of land was covered in lush greenery. During the rare times of the day where this rain would stop, the sky would be filled with a beautiful bluish light violet color that radiated life and vitality. Earth X1 didn't have any oceans, but what it did have were large networks of rivers that crisscrossed about its surface in raging torrents. It had 3 main river channels that were easily 50 kilometers wide and had lengths in the thousands of kilometers. All of the river networks found life from these 3, filling the planet with a rich vitality. Due to this ecosystem of rivers, Earth X1 only had freshwater systems. In addition, all of its soil was perfectly irrigated, leading to the richness of its vegetation and greenery. Earth X1 didn't have any polar ice caps because all of its water was quickly flowing from one place to another. As such, even its snowy caps had lush vegetation, albeit covered in thick layers of snow they had adapted to living in. The planet itself was about 5% larger than Earth, and despite lacking oceans, due to the large number of rivers, it was still covered by waters to a mark of about 70%. Visit. For the best no_vel_ed_ng experience, these things made Earth X1 a very hotly sought after commodity. Such an environment practically made the entire planet a perfect garden. And, with it entering Earth's fold of reality so quickly, it would have many centuries and millennia to take advantage of Earth's talent and birth force herbs maybe never before seen in the dimensional verse. It was this world that Lionel found himself and his brothers teleporting to. However, he didn't like what he saw almost immediately. Earth X1 was such a beautiful world, but the instant they stepped foot onto it they were already destroying it. The teleportation formation alone had cleared out a large 10 square meter space, and it clearly looked like it was done in a rush, or else there would be more destruction. In fact, the moment Lionel appeared, he caught sight of numerous individuals preparing to clear the forests around them. Stop! Lionel's voice thundered, catching the workers off guard. Visit. For the best no_vel_ed_ng experience, let alone the workers themselves, even Lionel's teammates were confused. This was basically a necessity. If they didn't clear the forests, how would they build their base? If they weren't quick about building their base, they would go from having some advantage to having no advantage at all in the face of these invaders. Lionel, however, couldn't bear to see this happen. He wasn't some save the forest activists, but he felt like if it wasn't absolutely necessary, why would they destroy something so beautiful? Plus, just from a cursory sweep of his internal sight, he had vastly better ideas than whatever these people were doing. Bring whoever is directing you all here for me quickly. It didn't take long for the workers to recognize Lionel as a prince and immediately follow his orders. They had all seen Lionel's face in the skies that day, and they had all heard Emperor Fox act to protect his grandson. If anything, it was almost impossible to find someone who didn't know Lionel on Earth. After giving these orders, Lionel immediately began to work on improving the teleportation formation. Rather than destroying the ecosystem like the others had, Lionel decided to work upward. Since they had already destroyed this patch of land, there was already no going back. So, Lionel used the materials he had been given to improve the formation and began to communicate with Little Tali to build upward. By now, Little Tali had firmly stepped in the fifth dimension, which had been the root cause of Lionel's skyrocketing skill. Without Little Tali holding him back, the crafts he could make were simply on another level. In just a few minutes, Lionel had already completed 3 floors of a simple tower structure. His engineering principles were so sound that his speed didn't seem to impact the structural integrity of the tower in the slightest. Visit. For a better user experience, if I build things this way, it'll be slightly inconvenient for large amounts of soldiers to trek outward. Okay, I'll modify it. Every new batch of soldiers will immediately be teleported to the top of the tower, then subsequently teleported down 1 floor at a time. They might get a bit dizzy, but this is the best I can do for now before a real base is built. By the time the temporary leader of the operation made it to Lionel, Lionel had already completed a tower with 10 floors, increasing the number of individuals who could be teleported over by tenfold. The temp leader, a middle-aged man sent from the imperial capital, stood in shock. He was a quite high-ranking government official and was just sent to maintain order here and ensure that Lionel didn't do anything crazy. But he suddenly realized that he would be nothing more than a figurehead here. He smiled bitterly. "I'm in over my head." Hammond was a man who had held his position before the metamorphosis, but he didn't hold any exceptional talent all to his own. He was basically as normal as they came. Any pride he had in his position immediately deflated when he saw Lionel build a 10-story tower in not even that many minutes. Minister Hammond, right? Lionel hopped down, formed the top of the tower, softly landing in the soil as he used his earth force to disperse the impact. Visit. For the best no_vel_ed_ng experience, Minister Hammond bowed deeply. Your Highness, that is indeed my name and title. Lionel nodded with a smile. No need to be so overly polite. I only called you here so that we could get on the same page. I think it's a bit of a shame to destroy the makeup of this world. I have a few options I think would be better and could help us in the long run. Minister Hammond looked up with a slightly relieved and partially curious light in his eyes. What did Lionel want to do exactly? Chapter 1021. Chapter 1021 River Network. The truth was that Lionel wasn't the only one who felt that keeping the ecosystem of this world intact was important. Even on Earth, much of the concrete jungle had been replaced with large swaths of forest and natural ecosystems. If they destroyed the natural environment of Earth, much of what it meant for them to come from talented worlds would be destroyed. After all Only by allowing Earth to grow in its natural state would the resources they were so looking forward to grow into maturity. The same could be said for Earth X1. It was just that they had barely gotten Earth to its current balanced state, they hadn't had time to worry about other worlds, not to mention the fact that Earth X1 had only recently entered Earth's fold of reality, so there wasn't anything they could have done earlier. On such a time crunch, they could only take the most forceful approach. But Lionel had other ideas. This is a unique environment. If we want to take advantage of it, whatever we build must first take it into consideration so we can maximize this effect. Do you know what the advantage of this planet is, Minister Hammond? Minister Hammond blinked before shaking his head. Please enlighten me, Prince. It's its rivers. The river networks of Earth X1 connect to every location on this planet. At its slowest, these river networks still move at hundreds of kilometers an hour. Its fastest rivers move within the thousands of kilometers an hour range. Lionel did a rough estimate of speed based on the discharge rate of the rivers. The speed he provided wasn't actually the speed of the river, but was rather what he estimated the speed of a boat on said river would be. The latest _IP_SODIs are on the website. This is what our advantage is. If this network of rivers is used efficiently, even in an infancy state, it would only take at most 2 or 3 hours to send reinforcements to a particular location. Once the network is mature, half an hour to an hour would be all that's necessary for reinforcements to reach any location. Lionel wasn't a fool. Earth simply didn't have the force crafters necessary to make a wide network of teleportation stations. In fact, Lionel didn't believe that the enemy would either. Space affinities were extremely rare, and force crafters that understood how to apply such principles to force arts were even rarer. This particular teleportation station was likely bought from a force crafter guild and was definitely the best the Milky Way had to offer, and yet it could only move 100 people at a time. This wasn't nearly enough for a large-scale war. In addition, the fact that Earth could only buy one even for an important order planet like this one, despite the wealth it had currently, spoke volumes. On top of this, even though Lionel could build this network, he simply didn't have the time. And even if he forced himself to find the time anyway, what would happen while he was away? What would happen when the enemy wisely targeted and destroyed these teleportation stations? Even if they managed to protect the teleportation stations, who would upkeep their maintenance? Lionel knew that he couldn't stretch himself too far. So he decided to kill multiple birds with a single stone. He would create a network that could be easily maintained without him while also protecting the ecosystem of Earth X1. Minister Hammond's gaze glowed, understanding much of Lionel's thought process without Lionel speaking aloud. Lionel was essentially pushing for simple crafts that could be forged by even weaker black-grade crafters. It was technology that even 21st century Earth would have had, let alone 25th century Earth. If the rivers were used as the propulsion system, all they needed to worry about was aerodynamics and ensuring that material of the boats were strong enough to withstand the high speeds. That was it. Minister Hammond could imagine that if this was executed properly, Earth would claim a decisive advantage on this world, and it was one the enemy wouldn't easily be able to claw back. Visit. For a better user experience, however, Minister Hammond had one scruple. I only have a single concern, if Prince doesn't mind hearing out this old man. Please speak. Lionel responded without hesitation. You don't have to hold back your opinions around me, he'll take them all into consideration. Minister Hammond sighed another breath of relief before nodding. Right. Though Earth X1's ecosystem is thriving, there's a lot of danger as well. The animal kingdom tends to be quite poisonous, and many of them have evolved to have excellent camouflage abilities. This was why we thought it safer to clear away the land for the sake of building a base. Beyond this, any creature that can survive the harsh rapid waters of the river is most definitely powerful to an extreme. I don't believe that these rivers won't have any dangers at all, in fact they might have the greatest dangers. Does Prince have a solution? Lionel nodded. He had considered this problem as well. Protecting nature always sounded like a beautiful idea, but the issue was that nature didn't always appreciate your kindness. The river creatures would, especially, be an obstacle, especially as they continued to birth more and more talented creatures under Earth's influence. Luckily, Lionel had a solution. Visit. For a better user experience, beasts can become very intelligent as they rise through the dimensions, but there are two problems they will face. For one, this world isn't as talented as Earth just yet, so most of the creatures will still be at a fourth-dimensional level. In fact, they're likely struggling to adapt to suddenly being thrust into a fifth-dimensional fold of reality as we speak, which is probably why you have yet to suffer any attacks. The second thing to consider is that though they might grow more intelligence, they will still lack the plasticity and flexibility of thought that humans have. The best counter to these beasts is right in front of us. Lionel suddenly took out a rainbow-colored beast crystal he had gotten from the Rainbow Island-sized piranha. He had planned to sell it to Jessica, but hadn't gotten around to it just yet. What beasts fear most is other beasts, especially beasts more powerful and more talented than they are. I have plans to create a shroud for the network of boats and floating forts we'll create. The first layer of defense will be these beast crystals. Normal creatures won't dare to get close to them as they can't yet match up to Earth's beasts. The second layer of defense will be concealment. Invalids aren't as intelligent as normal beasts, and rather than being off-put by powerful creatures, they'll surge toward them in hopes of evolving. This will be our second defense. As for the details, just leave it up to me. Lionel took a few steps out and entered the forest. Not far away, a small-sized river, at least by the metrics of this planet, lay at a width of a few hundred meters. With a light toss, the segmented cube left Lionel's hand. Just before it landed in the waters, its jigsaw pieces moved and morphed, connected by a large array of motes of light. The latest _IP_SODIs are on the website. With a splash, it landed, having become a large yacht. Chapter 1022. Chapter 1022. Layered hand. Earth's fold of reality slowly solidified. In this state of flux, it became comparatively easy to cross over. This was especially the case since the Milky Way was a predominantly fifth-dimensional galaxy. Since Earth was also currently entering the fifth dimension, it was more a process of assimilation than evolution, helping to facilitate the crossing over all the more. There were quite a number of powers waiting for an opportune time to cross over, and many that had already done so. Having lost the protection that came with being a lower-dimensional world, Earth had begun vulnerable and thus had no choice but to gain the strength to defend itself. This moment was one that many had been preparing for a long while. Those that came from higher-order worlds had many special techniques for predicting and marking the borders of evolving folds of reality and had thus scouted out the region long in advance. With the information in their hands, they retreated, knowing the danger of being present in an area a fold of reality was moving over. However, now they were prepared to make a move forward once again. Those with confidence in themselves eyed pieces of the order worlds. But there were many that chose to not overestimate themselves, aiming for B and C order worlds, feeling that they wouldn't be as protected. However, these people had no way of knowing that Emperor Fox was a madman. Not only had he focused his most elite troops on the lower order worlds, he had left Earth X1 and Earth X2 to his still maturing grandsons. Visit. For the best no_underscore_G experience, are you sure about this? Within a ship streaking through the vast stars, a meeting was taking place. Though their destination had already been picked, many still weren't sure about their leader's choice. Since it wasn't too late to change their destination, some were still doing their best. However, it seemed that this group was just a minority. At first glance, these individuals looked like normal humans. However, upon second inspection it was possible to see that these people weren't entirely so. Many of them had odd birthmarks randomly growing upon their skin that upon a closer look actually seemed to be no different from the bark of a tree. Some didn't have these marks at all, but considering their nonchalance toward their fellow comrades' imperfections, it was likely that they had similar imperfections just placed in less than obvious locations. At the helm of the room, the man who this question had been aimed toward had a similar birthmark. However, his own was prominently placed on his forehead and had a rich brown color to it. Rather than seeming out of place, it actually gave him a lofty character the others didn't have. "I've already explained myself once, what need do I have to do it again?" he replied coldly. The man who had questioned him immediately became flustered. The discussions were still amicable to this point, but it seemed that they had pushed it too far. They had clearly almost forgotten just who this man was. "If you fear death, what right do you have to follow Her Holiness? The latest _IP_SODIs are on the website. No. I didn't mean it that way. It's just that though Her Holiness is all-knowing and all-powerful, we are not. We never asked the other branches for help like we should have." "For help?" The man rose, the brownish gold bark on his forehead radiating an oppressive aura. "Do you know what happened just a couple months ago?" The others shivered, unable to say a word. Though joining a religion gave you untold power, it was also a shackle like no other. So long as you were in the face of someone more favored by your god or goddess than yourself, it was impossible to raise even a finger of resistance. Compared to them all, this man was a tier higher and as such held the ultimate strength. They didn't have the option to resist even if they wanted to, and leaving the religion wasn't an option either, or else all of their strength would be stripped from them in the best case, and in most cases they would die horrible deaths. A month ago, a blasphemer of Her Holiness slaughtered one of our brothers, a pious follower of Her Holiness, the goddess of the evergreen. Our faith lost a 3-layered hand, but this is only the beginning. This blasphemer not only killed a child of Her Holiness, but he also destroyed Her Holiness mark. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. A shocked silence reigned over the ship. At that moment, whatever hesitancy they had turned into a righteous indignation. For the mark of the goddess to be destroyed was a slap in the face of their holiness. This wasn't something they could allow. This blasphemer is a citizen of Earth. This isn't just about spreading the word of Her Holiness, it is a crusade to wipe this blemish from her name and make those of the secular world understand the nature of Her Holiness evergreen. The atmosphere boiled over. However, though the man who had initially questioned 4-layered hand Eames seemed to be dutifully praying right now, his heart was shaken. He wasn't fearful of Earth and its people. That wasn't why he had brought up such concern to begin with. The issue was that they had gotten word that 2 colossuses of the religious world had chosen to move in on Earth as well. However, their 4-layered hand was blinded by his own greed and refused to call over reinforcements. It was clear that Eames wanted to promote to 5-layered and likely even the legendary 6-layered hand. Only by claiming land in such a fertile world would he have a chance at doing so. So, against all their advice, he had chosen to target an order world. But at what cost? Adelard clenched his fists within his robes tightly. We need to sweep through this planet as quickly as possible and lay our roots deeply. Within the nature of this planet, our evergreen force will have a great advantage. In addition, due to the blessings of Her Holiness and our location advantage, we should be ahead of everyone else by at least half a day. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. I can only hope that this will be enough. Without proper reinforcements, it might be possible that their evergreen religion would be wiped from the face of this galaxy. From start to finish, though, Adelard never worried about what resistance the people of Earth would put up. Chapter 1023. Chapter 1023 Soundless, the ship of the Evergreen Goddess believers streaked through the vastness of space. In just a few hours they entered the range of Earth X1's solar system, a bright yellow sun hanging a long distance away. The trip had been exceptionally smooth. They had long since calculated the least turbulent route, and due to Eames' ambition, he had used up a large amount of accumulated evergreen force to ensure that they would be ahead of everyone else. Though Adelard was right to be worried about the other religions that had come to the Milky Way, especially after they had monopolized much of the galaxy for so long, that didn't mean that they didn't have any advantages. Due to the fact their temple was located here, they could make use of years of accumulation to accomplish things these other 2 religions could not. As such, they had a head start on everyone else, even though this head start cost them centuries of accumulation. In Eames' estimation, though, it was all worth it. In a religion, one was able to rely on your God for certain things. These things could be asked for in prayer, and the return you received would be a function of your piousness and your offerings. Piousness was often measured by what level you had reached in a religion, each one having their own ranking system. As for offerings, for the Evergreen religion, it was a measurement of evergreen force. Visit. For the best no_vel_ed_ng experience, evergreen force could be accumulated through meritorious feats, sacrifices and offerings of treasures. These could then be converted into units of evergreen force which could be put toward prayer. Having been rooted in the Milky Way Guild for so long, the Evergreen religion had most definitely accumulated large amounts of evergreen force, and they had a home field advantage the others would not have, as there were certain complicated penalties associated with prayers involving events that were too far away. Without overcomplicating matters, the fact was that Eames had sacrificed much of their Evergreen branch's previous efforts all for the sake of Earth X1, because the world was simply too perfect for them. What better world could there possibly be for their Evergreen religion to thrive than one with such lush greenery? And this was a sentiment that even those who had disagreed with Eames' methods immediately agreed with the moment they laid eyes on the beautiful planet hanging upon nothing. Earth X1 was filled with crisscrossing rivers and 2 soft ice caps delicately covered with soft snow. The rest was nothing but endless greenery, with trees so tall they threatened to pierce through the atmosphere and puncture a hole through it all. Eames stood with a dignified expression on his face as he faced the wide glass windows. But his heart jumped and leapt with joy. Even from here he could feel the rich wood force even as it slowly grew more and more powerful. Calming himself, he took a deep breath. Visit. For the best no_underscore_underscore_undersng experience, follow the plan. Land at point A and take root. Our first priority is to build our shrine to Her Holiness. In that way, this will become the new main base of our evergreen religion in this galaxy. Yes. The ship shot around the planet before descending at a pre-selected location. Back when Earth X1 had yet to enter Earth's fold of reality, Eam had long since scouted out the region. Then, through prayer, he located the best location to build their shrine. The ship came to a grinding halt after descending through the atmosphere. Its pressure caused the waves of water beneath it to separate and spread, almost flooding the opposite banks. Unsurprisingly, the evergreen religion was also very much invested in protecting nature. This wasn't only a fundamental root of their teachings, but it also had selfish foundations as well. After all, if they destroyed the greenery, the wood force would weaken, and so would they. Accumulating evergreen force in this place will be at least 3 times faster than normal. The latest _IP_SODIs are on the website. Eam stood on the helm of the ship, his underlings having already gotten to work. While the ship hovered above the water of the large river, on the coast dozens of brown-robed individuals sat beneath the trees in silent mediation. At first it seemed like nothing would happen, but very quickly, wood force began to accumulate and the already large trees actually began to grow. The branches began to reach over and intertwine with one another. Even the thinnest grew thicker than a man's waist. At the same time, even branches from 2 separate trees began to fuse as though they had always been one. It was an astonishing sight to see. Very quickly, these intertwining branches became elaborate tree homes that carried an elegance even beyond normally built estates. And, at the same time, they didn't disrupt the natural ecosystem even one bit. If one looked closely, it even seemed that the trees had been strengthened. How could they not be? The brown-robed men and women had all been using 5th-dimensional wood force to help these trees grow, while many of the trees themselves were still within the 4th dimension. Help the shrine take root. Once this is finished, we can be said to have taken a strong foothold. Eam directed traffic. Once he was satisfied, he fell to his knees in deep prayer, the bark on his forehead beginning to shimmer as the blessings of the evergreen goddess began to strengthen their fort to an extreme. If it had already been powerful before, now it had a certain enigmatic character to it that was difficult to deal with. Just as Eam was about to put the finishing touches, investing even more evergreen force into their new home, a shout caught him completely off guard. Visit. For a better _user experience, 4-layered hand, sir. The distance. Before Eam could lose his temper, his pupils constricted. Without a sound, 6 boats moving at hundreds of kilometers an hour appeared over the horizon. They were already within a kilometer before anyone had noticed anything. At the helm, a young man with pale violet hair stood at the edge of the ship, his gaze narrowed. Chapter 1024. Chapter 1024. Speed. Eam's heart jumped. None of the normal signs of an approaching enemy had been there. There wasn't an influx of force, there wasn't an odd sound, there were no fluctuations in space. There was absolutely nothing. It took him a moment to understand, but he soon grasped it. There were none of those signs to grab a hold of because they weren't there to begin with. Those boats weren't being propelled by force, they were being propelled by nothing more than wind and the rapid waters. On top of that, because they were using the water, their movements were masked by the rivers itself. It was no wonder none of them had realized that something was wrong until they were already so close. After understanding this, Eam calmed. He had been through a lot in his life, and as a man who had been willing to uproot everything on this singular bet, he was decisive and intelligent as well. He immediately came up with several weaknesses to this clever plot of Earth, one of the main ones being that if Earth was intent on using river flow for movement, that meant that they could only ever attack from one direction. Eam stored these conclusions away and immediately stood. His gaze narrowed when he got a better look at Lionel's face. To think he would meet the man who killed his 3-layered hand brother so quickly. It seemed that the goddess worked in mysterious ways and had laid this opportunity at his feet. The others weren't aware of this, but the truth was that after Lionel shattered the seal that would have been placed on him, he had gained the fury of the evergreen goddess. As such, his head was worth a large amount of evergreen force so long as he was sacrificed to their altar. The real reason Eam had been willing to take this enormous risk was that Lionel's head was worth more than 10 times the evergreen force he had used to gain this speed advantage over everyone else eyeing Earth. Visit. For a better user experience, so, seeing Lionel now, it felt to Eam as though everything was snapping into place, as though the world itself wanted him to succeed and like the goddess was smiling down upon him. Prepare for battle. He roared. They had already set up their shrine in the 2 hours it had taken for Lionel and the others to get here. Though not everything was complete, it was enough to give them a small area of affected vantage and dampen many of the oppression they would normally face after entering another's fold of reality. This was the advantage that religion provided. At that moment, the layered hands began to get into formation. Though they were men of goddess, they were very much used to battle. In fact, even compared to other organizations, they were even a cut above. Despite the speed of the raging waters, none of them was fazed, and they easily stepped onto the rapid waves, forming up a strong formation before the quickly speeding boats. Now that the formation of 6 was closer, they got a good look at the design. Those who had some crafter experience couldn't help but nod their heads in appreciation toward the perfect design of the boats. They were truly built for speed. At that moment, the 6 sleek boats suddenly simultaneously released their parachute systems, cutting their speeds in half as heavy anchors fell. In as little as 100 meters, they had come to a grinding halt. But things didn't stop there. For a better user experience, the so-called parachute system were actually wings of silver the boats suddenly deployed. Despite their thin and frail appearances, they hardly rocked as they brought the boats to a stop and also formed up a line of sturdy barricades at the same time. In the blink of an eye, the formation of 6 sleek boats had become a miniature fort on the ocean, turning the advantage the Evergreen brothers and sisters had had in mounting a defense to almost nil. Fire! Lionel's voice boomed over the battlefield. At that moment, Eam became almost too keenly aware that Lionel was the only individual present. At least, Lionel was the only one visible right this moment. And yet he had just barked out orders. Before Eam could understand what was happening, a rain of hundreds of arrows suddenly shot out from above. The speed. Eam and the others were completely caught off guard. From the boats appearing, to them coming to a grinding halt and suddenly firing, not even half a minute had passed. The sudden shifts in the battlefield were far faster than anything they had ever been a part of. Again? The latest _IP_SODIs are on the website. Before the first wave even landed, Lionel roared again. In a panic, the religious men and women put up their defenses, trying to work together to create a large shield of wood. Their speed was exceptionally fast, especially under the influence of their nearby shrine. And yet, it was right then that Lionel pointed out 2 fingers. Range. Despite still being 200 meters away from their front line and despite the fact that 2 volleys of arrows had already been loosed, Lionel's spear force still made it first. The barely constructed wooden shield was sliced in 2 and continued unhindered, piercing into the hull of the spaceship still hovering above the waters and bisecting it as well. Under the horrified gazes of the Evergreen brothers and sisters, their ship collapsed into the water and the shield was sliced apart, interrupting their rhythm. With their collaborative efforts destroyed, their attempt to build a large shield failed and they could only quickly attempt to put up their own individual defenses. But it was exactly then that the first and second volley fell, causing a chorus of pained cries to call out. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience right then, Lionel shot forward. From behind the silver wings of the sleek boats, 8 individuals quickly followed suit. With a flip of his palm, a wooden spear of deep black appeared in Lionel's hand, his speed so fast that the water seemed to separate below him as a streak of gold followed his wake. Chapter 1025. Chapter 1025. Swingim was almost shocked into complete inaction. Slicing apart the wooden shield was one matter. However, bisecting a ship designed to weather the dangers of space was a completely different matter entirely. This ship was designed to handle the extreme temperatures of stars, withstand the barrage of an asteroid belt with a 1-star disaster rating, and even capable of surviving a sudden change in fold of reality. It could be said that spaceships were designed to be among the sturdiest builds in the whole of the dimensional verse, which was why it was especially insane that Lionel escaped planet Vincero with one he personally designed. And yet, with a single stroke of 2 fingers, this ship was cut in 2. How could Eam not be shocked? How could he possibly be so powerful? Eam's mind spun, realizing that the situation was most definitely not good. Facing an enemy with such a strong offensive output even without relying on a weapon was among the most dangerous things you could do in the dimensional verse. Understanding the danger they were in, Eam immediately made a decision. Bang. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, Eam's palms slammed together, his aura blazing. At just a single glance, it became clear and obvious that he was actually at Tier 7 of the 5th dimension. But, as a servant of the Evergreen Goddess, This meant much less than his ranking, 4-layered hand. Im was confident that he could battle it out and even had a good chance of defeating Lionel. However, even if he did so, it would be a Pyrrhic victory. Aside from his, there were only a dozen 3-layered hands that had come and the rest were 2-layered or 1-layered. The strength they could display was much less, and for most of them, their strength of faith was much weaker than their own strength, as such they relied on the latter. By the time he defeated Lionel, it was likely that their current number would fall. There weren't many clergymen of the Evergreen Goddess in general. The more people there were, the less evergreen force there would be to pass around, so religions tended to have small numbers of true believers. As a result, each was precious and the loss of too many would result in an overall weakening of the faith. If Im failed to protect his people, let alone being promoted, he would likely be demoted. In that case he would have to take a chance. Im released a low roar, the wood force in the surroundings surging toward him. The illusory image of a lotus formed of several wooden hands began to shimmer into existence. However, it was clear at a single glance that this lotus was far more elaborate than the last Lionel had seen. Seeing Im's actions, the 3-layered hands of the clergymen also took action, feeling large amounts of evergreen force surging out from their shrine and toward them. With the support of their base, their strength became at least a half better than it was normally. Lionel's speed never slowed. However, he wasn't the first one to reach them. The latest _IP_SODIs are on _the website. Gil shot by him, arc of crimson lightning following his steps. Taking advantage of the break in their organized formation caused by the rain of arrows, 2 daggers flipped about his fingers and palms as he appeared within their midst like a flash. Lionel was the second to arrive, his spear immediately beginning to dance about. The smoothness of his cuts were so immaculate that the spray of blood was heavily delayed. Sometimes, even long after falling to the surface of the water, the corpses were pushed into the distance by the raging tide without leaking a drop of blood. Interesting. Lionel didn't stop the preparation of the 3- and 4-layered hands because he somewhat felt that it was impossible to do so. Instead, then, it was better to whittle down whatever resistance there was as much as possible before he continued onward. A single sweep of his spear seemed to take a half-dozen head at a minimum. It was as though whatever location he wanted his spear to reach, it would do so. His current abilities made Vanishing Spear seem more like a joke than anything else. When the added range of Lionel's spear force was combined with his marksmanship and calculative abilities, the result was absolutely devastating. Even Lionel himself had underestimated just how powerful this breakthrough in his spear force was. At that moment, Lionel's expression turned serious. Bronze runes raced across his skin and a silver armor appeared not long after. With a step, he appeared before a 3-layered hand just as the remaining 7 of his brothers crashed into the clergyman army. Before the latter could react, his head had flown into the air, his last expression being one of unwillingness and shock. Lionel's sudden attack was completely outside of their expectations, and so was his sudden and abrupt uptick in power. The latest _IP_SODIs are on _the website. Several wooden lotuses spun, their hands assaulting Lionel from all sides. However, he pretended as though he hadn't seen them at all. Lionel's gaze flashed, the tip of his spear suddenly erupting with a silver-red flame as he pierced into seemingly empty space. Bang! Hearing the satisfying crunch, Lionel grinned. That was one seal down. It seemed it wasn't so difficult to blaspheme a god after all. If before he had to rely on his Scarlet Star Force, now he had Radiant Fire Force. He didn't have to choose between either destroying his own body or relying on a much inferior Fire Force. As expected, though Radiant Fire Force was nowhere near Scarlet Star Force in destructive capabilities, compared to normal Fire Force, it was countless levels above. This seal only seems to appear when the clergyman is of a certain rank. That makes sense, the higher their rank, the more their goddess values them. So, this seal will likely only appear for those at the 3-layered hand level and higher. Lionel immediately came to this conclusion as his body flashed, dodging out of the way of several wooden palms and appearing to the back of another 3-layered hand. One movement, one swing, and there came yet another head. The latest _IP_SODIs are on _the website. Chapter 1026. Chapter 1026. Quickly, the rage of the clergyman was practically palpable. As much as they were infuriated that someone had killed their fellow brothers and sisters, they were even more infuriated that this individual had actually destroyed the seal of their goddess. Im was especially furious. The more 3-layered hands that died, the more likely it was that he would be punished and the less likelihood he would have at defending a position on this world. This Lionel had to die. Eam roared, his lotus finally completely forming. However, compared to the others, there was a clear and striking difference. His own pumped with veins of gold, giving the wood a more ancient and dignified character. Just the pressure it exuded alone was enough to dwarf the other lotuses entirely. Whether it was 1 or 3 layered hands, all of them fell into the category of junior clergymen. However, upon stepping into the 4-layered hand ranking, Eam officially became a senior clergyman. His power was on a completely different level compared to the others. However, just as his confidence was hitting a peak, he was immediately shocked to find that Lionel had appeared before him. It was as though Lionel was waiting for the perfect time to come. Knowing that it was impossible to stop Eam, he instead chose to come right this moment before he could even think of targeting the others. Leave it to us, Cap. By the time Lionel appeared before Eam, there were exactly 8 of the 12 3-layered hands left. It was clear that this was by no measure a coincidence. The latest _AP_SODs are on the website. Charge. The one who roared this out was Lionel. The moment he did, the silver wings of the half-dozen boats in the distance split, revealing a flood of warriors. Though they weren't the most elite troop of Avalon, they weren't bad either, most of them having a firm hold within the 4th dimension. The timing was once again perfect. The clergymen had their hands full with dealing with the 9 of them, causing the formation to scatter and weaken. Just when they thought they would finally have some relief as they became occupied by their 3-layered hands, a group of twice their numbers suddenly charged for them, leaving them all at a complete loss. The worst part of it was that Lionel and the others had already killed all of the 5th-dimensional existences beneath the 3-layered hand rank, leaving them not only outnumbered, but without even a strength advantage to take advantage of. They were finished. Eam's forehead pulsed with rage as several wooden palms attempted to smash Lionel to death. This feels different, Lionel thought as he calmly dodged. It isn't just that this is more powerful, there's a certain character to it as well. It feels a lot like the artistic conceptions that I've been basing my mage arts on recently. I see. It's a style. Lionel came to an understanding. Things are like this then, visit. For a better user experience, Lionel's body swayed and shuffled. Rather than slicing apart the arms as he did normally, he allowed them to swarm him. Very soon, it felt as though he was being smothered and caged. Eam's gaze sharpened, sensing an opportunity. He didn't understand what Lionel was trying to do, but in battle, second-guessing yourself when there was a chance of victory right before you was a massive taboo. If you didn't have the confidence to fight, you had likely already died long ago. Many of Eam's wooden palms shot into the water below, beginning to wind and intertwine about each other, forming a cage below and above Lionel that he had no chance of escaping. Evergreen style, creaking wood. A strong surge of evergreen force blossomed forth from the center of the lotus. It rotated about, its sudden action causing the trap Eam had set to snap into place and block out all of Lionel's potential escape paths. A palm much larger and far more elaborate than the others descended with an unprecedented momentum. The waters beneath Lionel's feet had already split apart long before it reached even 10 meters above him, displaying its power outright. However, its target was completely unmoved. While it was true that there was no escape to the right or left or down and up, who said that he had wanted to escape in the first place? The waters beneath Lionel's feet began to sizzle, his gaze flashing with a slight silver-crimson color for just the briefest of moments. It was one thing if Lionel didn't have a time crunch, but this was hardly the only enemy he had to deal with. There were more yet still coming, and there would be even more after even them. He didn't just need to win, he needed to win quickly. Holding back and bringing out trump cards one after another wasn't conducive to this at all. The latest _AP_SODs are on the website. So, he didn't do that. 4 Seasons Realm, Summer, Radiant Core. Bang. The palm suddenly came to a grinding halt. In the beginning, it looked as though it was stopped by nothing more than air. It was only after a second inspection that it was possible to see a small sphere of silver crimson hanging upon Lionel's palm. The core trembled lightly, radiating out with a heat that caused billowing steam to rise up from Lionel's feet. At the same time, it seemed to release a barrier around it that the palm above couldn't cross no matter how hard it tried. It was firmly stopped 5 meters above the core, unable to move a single inch. At the same time, the palm of wood began to sizzle along with the water, its surface being burnt away piece by piece until to Eam's horror, it began to crumble. Lionel's spear hand twisted, his wooden spear dancing in his hand before piercing forward. The radiant core balanced upon its tip, using the momentum of Lionel's spear swing to shoot upward and shatter the palm entirely. Visit For the best no underserving experience at that moment, as though the lotus had lost its supporting core, the cage around Lionel began to crumble along with the arm. In the blink of an eye, a lotus that had dwarfed all the others was burnt to ash, leaving nothing but a small radiant core the size of a palm hanging in the skies above. Chapter 1027. Chapter 1027. Stepe's heart shook when he looked at the small ball of reddish-silver flames. He could feel the danger stored within it to the point it made his heart skip several beats. It was such that he almost completely forgot to react to the fact that his lotus had actually crumbled. He knew what happened. Lionel had targeted the core of the lotus and ruined its structural integrity. But though Eam understood this, it didn't mean that he was willing to accept it. Doing such a thing required understanding the style to an in-depth degree. It was something Eam had only seen when higher-ranking clergymen faced lower-ranking ones. It simply didn't make sense to him that Lionel could do this. Let's call this ability Dream Rupture. Dream Rupture. It was Lionel's ability to grasp the artistic conception of an enemy, find the root of it, and destroy it from the inside out. It was an ability that Lionel felt rose a level above finding the weakness of a normal technique. This dream rupture instantly became one of his stronger powers. Lionel found that when he stepped into the fifth dimension firmly, his sensitivity toward the nature of things and the artistic conceptions that they represented was heightened. Of course, this made perfect sense as Lionel had always been meditating on the natural force art that was the core formation of Dimensional Cleanse's third layer. The latest _sods are on the website. As Lionel tried to master his natural force art, his comprehensions grew deeper and the way he saw the world began to subtly change. If the improvement in his spear force was half due to the fact he had switched to using a wooden spear as his main weapon, then it could be said that the other half was related to his meditation on Dimensional Cleanse. His summer comprehension, Radiant Core, was another example of his grasp of artistic conception shining through. Despite it only being a quarter of the four seasons realm and couldn't display its full power without the other three seasons being present, it was actually still so powerful. The Radiant Core shot down from the skies, once again finding itself hovering above the tip of Lionel's spear. Yet, despite its heat, it didn't seem to affect the wooden spear in the slightest. Eam's expression flashed and suddenly became ferocious. With a single glance, he could tell that this battle was lost. It wasn't just him who had lost, but his three-layered hands were just a few exchanges from no longer being able to hold on. However, just as he wanted to use his countermeasures to escape, Lionel's hand suddenly stretched out. Valiant Seal. The latest _AP_SODs are on the website. A strong surge of space and earth elemental force soared. As heavy as the wood force in the air was, the earth force and water force were just as heavily present. The ease with which Lionel completed this spell, even at the expense of more than half his stamina, was far beyond any speed Eam could match. Right then Eam finished chanting and the pendant on his neck began to glow. A moment later his body vanished. But, bang! Eam crashed into the spatial walls of the Valiant Seal, a cry of pain and horror leaving his throat. Lionel shook his head. Eam ended up even more miserable than the Black Swan had. At least the latter's death was swift. But Eam had tried to forcefully teleport himself away, only to be restrained. That sort of forced end to a teleportation could end horribly in several ways and, despite Eam's current sorry state, he could actually be considered to be lucky in how things turned out for him. Lionel's Valiant Seal was constructed based on the artistic conception of a treasure capable of forcefully keeping a subdimensional zone open. As long as something was within the parameters of the fifth dimension, it was simply far too difficult to deal with. In fact, Lionel felt that if he could properly improve his Valiant Seal, it would be a spell that followed him for a long time. It could be used flexibly for both attack and defense and was a mage art that Lionel was especially proud of. It was just unfortunate that passing it on to others would be difficult since you would have to have an extremely high space and earth affinity to cast it. Lionel couldn't think of a single person that met that requirement. The latest _AP_SODs are on the website. This should be the end of things for now. I really didn't expect enemies to get here so quickly. It seems that things could quickly get complicated. Lionel reached out a palm and squeezed. He wasn't confident in whether or not the seal that protected Eam was stronger than the others or not. If it wasn't, everything would be fine. But if it was and he was forced to use his Scarlet Star Force again, it wasn't worth it. So rather than doing this, Lionel chose to toss him into a snow globe and worry about it later. Of course though Lionel used the Valiant Seal, to pin him down and take his storage treasures first, then he threw him away. Gem? Lionel's head whipped around. Reacting quickly, he sent his valiant seals hurtling through the air in a particular direction. His gaze happened to lock onto the battle between Arnold and a three-layered hand. However, he was still a step too late. Before his valiant seals reached their destination, the three-layered hand vanished from sight, just barely dodging Arnold's palm before he was crushed into minced meat. Lionel's brow furrowed lightly. Visit. For a better user experience, the pendant that Eam had tried to use was a high-level bronze-grade treasure, and the same was the case for this man who had just disappeared. But it was clear that none of the others had this treasure, so it was obviously not something the Evergreen Goddess gave to all her high-level subjects. The reason Lionel wanted to stop this man was precisely because it was odd that he had this treasure, and Lionel's instincts told him that he should try to stop him. Unfortunately, Lionel was still a step too late. Chapter 1028. Chapter 1028. One group across the Milky Way, in a religious building that had turned quite silent to this point, Aderlard appeared, gasping for breath. This location was none other than the abandoned shrine of the Evergreen religion and had once been their main base of operations. Eam, in all his ambitions, had chosen to uproot them completely and move everything to Earth X1. If the bet worked out, there was no doubt that there would be a great boon to take advantage of. However, even Aderlard couldn't have imagined that the Earthlings would be so powerful. At first, he thought that the only anomaly was Lionel, but he realized that without showing his hidden trump cards, he had no chance to defeat Arnold either. He realized then that he had made a grave mistake. He had been so worried about the other religions come to encroach of the Evergreen Goddess territory that he hadn't even considered the idea that Earth would fight back. It was beyond just the idea of them having the strength to do so or not, though. Usually, lower-level worlds were hesitant to fight back against religions because of the power their gods and goddesses represented. There was a reason why Aderlard was scared of the clergymen of other religions, but not of the other families and organizations aiming for Earth. But it was either that Earth was ignorant to what it meant to offend a god or they simply didn't care. And Aderlard was afraid that it was the latter. The perfect counter to religious force was world force. When Lionel fought his first clergyman at Valiant Heart Mountain, he had analyzed Evergreen force to feel like a cross between universal force and world force. In truth, he wasn't entirely incorrect as it had aspects of both. The latest _IP_SODIs are on the website. Without getting lost in the details of it all, a powerful world spirit was able to counter the advantages religions could usually create for themselves. This was why many religions targeted weaker galaxies to spread their religion. With Earth's talent, Aderlard was sure that Earth's world spirit was also powerful. He had originally thought that it would still take time to mature, but if they were actually so bold in killing clergymen without thought for the consequences. Aderlard took a deep breath and shook his head. Lionel had no idea that his decisiveness had actually bought Earth valuable time to grow, while Aderlard had no idea that the wielder of the world spirit, Lionel's mother, was nowhere near Earth's fold of reality right this moment. This is still an opportunity. I can make a trip to another branch and slowly replenish my Evergreen force. Then I can. Just as Aderlard was thinking of what his next steps could be, he froze. Up ahead, there was what could only be described as a goddess descended from on high. She wore a white and fluttering dress, and the small bits of skin she revealed were enticing to an extreme. It was just a shame that she actually wore a veil and no one could see what peak her beauty reached fully. Aderlard was immediately on guard. He had always been a cautious person, but this woman had appeared without even alerting him. He even had a feeling that had she not allowed it, he would have never found her. "Your shrine has been uprooted?" she said lightly. "Visit." For a better user experience, the voice was as delicate as a spring breeze and was easily 10 times as refreshing. She seemed to sing with her words despite the fact she was only speaking normally. "What? Yes." Our four-layered hand made a gamble and lost. "I see, so you chose to try to plant a seed on Earth as well, but you were destroyed." Aderlard clenched his fists but didn't say anything. He couldn't understand why, but his entire back was drenched with cold sweat. This young woman didn't seem to be exuding any killing intent, and she seemed as harmless as a fly, but right now he wanted to do nothing more than turn tail and run. The veil of the young woman shifted. It looked as though she might have smiled, or maybe she had frowned. Aderlard's palms were too drenched for him to focus on the difference. "You're scared." She spoke so lightly that it was difficult to tell whether she was asking a question or stating something. She might have even been trying to comfort him, but he wasn't in the state of mind to know. This tends to happen when people can sense my religious force, and it mostly only does when I'm in the presence of other clergymen. I think that's why he was so fascinating to me. He could definitely feel my religious force, and yet he wasn't scared at all. In fact, he treated me like a little girl. But I guess when you're so dangerous yourself, why should you feel fear? The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. Adelard had no idea what she was talking about at this point. It took everything he had to keep his knees from buckling and collapsing beneath him. Even his eyes were forced to rapidly blink as he tried to keep the sweat streaking down his brow from stinging them. He is very dangerous, too dangerous. But he hasn't done anything bad yet. It's a very hard moral dilemma. Should you kill someone knowing that they will do something horrible? Or should you wait until after they've done it? The young lady sighed, seemingly talking to herself at this point. Shaking her head, her gaze fell onto Adelard again. You have it with you, correct? Adelard froze. According to customs, in case of a head clergyman going rogue, a second-in-command has the right to request aid, isn't that correct? And I have a feeling that a smart man like you used that aid to give yourself a way out. If I was as smart as you were, I would request a secondary shrine. There was only one group of people that would care for the shrine of a religion that wasn't their own. Visits. For a better user experience. Chapter 1029. Chapter 1029. Woodworking. Lionel's brow furrowed. He didn't like the fact this person was able to escape. Something told him that it would bring him more trouble in the future. Forget it. What's done is done. Very quickly, what remained of the battle came to a close. Most of the clergymen were directly killed. As for those that surrendered, Lionel chose to throw them all into the snow globes. Lionel didn't have the heart to slaughter people that had given up, but he also knew that it would be impossible to try to integrate these people into Earth's population like they were currently doing for the people of Terrain. The people of Terrain had no choice but to rely on Earth. Their original world was practically empty now. They had no methods to return easily, and Earth provided them a better future due to the implemented policies of Lionel's grandfather. Most people of Terrain were a lot like the people of Earth before the metamorphosis, not knowing much about the wider dimensional verse. But these clergymen didn't share the same ignorance of the world, and they wouldn't have the same gratefulness the people of Terrain would foster. If anything, they'd be a ticking time bomb ready to erupt at any time. Without a choice, Lionel could only throw them all into snow globes. At least this form of imprisonment didn't allow them a chance to escape, and everything would remain under his control. Visit. For the best no_vel_ed_g experience, this operation didn't go poorly. Our casualties are few and the speed boats work as designed. How do you guys feel? Lionel asked. Franco swung his arm as though he was already ready for another fight in response. Lightweight. He grinned wildly. Lionel laughed. He had been paying attention to their battles, and their prowess was beyond his expectations. He realized that he had looked down on his teammates far too much. Maybe if he had chosen to grow with them from the very beginning rather than just chasing after Aina alone, they would be far more powerful. He felt a bit of guilt toward this. After all, he was always so worried about morality and the lives and deaths of strangers, but he always left his own brothers behind to fend for themselves. He truly was all over the place. A few with water affinity, come over, Lionel called out. After giving a few directions, a small squadron of those with water-related abilities came forward and began to pull the sunken spaceship out of the waters. Visit. For the best no_vel_ed_g experience, this space has enough material to make at least a dozen more speed boats. As for the useless material, I'm sure I can find another purpose for it. Hm? Lionel cast a glance into Eam's spatial treasure and his pupils constricted. After a moment of thought, he came to an understanding. How lucky. They must have tried to uproot their whole religion and take root here. It's no wonder Head have so much wealth on him. They wanted Earth X1 to be their new base of operation. The wealth within Eam's spatial treasure was not small. In fact, it was greater than the wealth that Lionel had dug up from planet Solara if only herb was considered. There were 20,000 kilograms of fifth-dimensional herb present, enough to pay Lionel's bounty twice over, if his bounty was still the same, that is. Aside from the herb ore, there were many precious ornaments, all of which were shaped of wood and sized into various statues. From a cursory glance, Lionel guessed that these either depicted their goddess Evergreen or important figures of the Evergreen religion. The force they radiated was a dense Evergreen force, and they were likely designed to be displayed within the church. Lionel wasn't exactly certain if these were valuable or not, so he set them aside for the moment. What did intrigue him, though, were the pile of old texts that were neatly arranged in their own corner of the spatial treasure. Many of them were religious texts that retold tales with valuable lessons or accounts of their goddess feats. But there were a pile of technique-oriented texts that caught Lionel's attention. Of course, Lionel didn't have wood elemental force, so he wasn't very interested in this for himself. Rather, he was more interested in what these techniques could do for their war efforts. Visit. For a better user experience with a flip of his palm, Lionel took out one of these texts, his gaze glowing. Principles of Wood Elemental Architecture. This text began with reminders of the importance of nature and harmony before it introduced methods of creating homes for humans without interfering with the fundamental state of an ecosystem. However, this was just the simplest section of the text. It went on to describe what was known as an architecture style that reminded Lionel a lot of concepts of feng shui back from Earth. Essentially, depending on the complexity and delicate balance of the arrangement, a certain architectural creation could either be more powerful or less powerful. Within the crafting lessons Lionel's father left behind for him, there was a section on working with living things and another section on woodworking. The living things section encompassed everything from beast crystals down to rare crafts that required certain force herbs to complete. As for woodworking, it was an intriguing lesson that Lionel had yet to gain the opportunity to apply. Currently, Lionel used woodworking purely to solidify and improve the designation of his fingers. That required doing things like carving out small statues or other small woodworks. He also knew that this would be important in the future because except in the case of some rare metal and gem trees, little Tali's abilities didn't work on normal wood. However, it seemed that his lessons on woodworking might finally come in handy on a broader scale. This text was definitely a heaven sent. Lionel's solution to not disrupt the ecosystem had been to build on the water. It was a fine solution and allowed for quick deployment of the speed boats, but the defenses weren't as great as he would like, nor were there any terrain advantages to take hold of. The latest _IP_SODs are on the website. This text would be a great help to ending this war and solidifying Earth's defenses quickly. Just one more chapter coming today. Love you all, love. Chapter 1030. Chapter 1030 Lake Crossing. The main base of Earth X1 underwent enormous changes in just a few days. The chosen location was one of the only 2 points on the whole of the planet where the 3 largest rivers intersected. Due to an odd case of flow dynamics and physics, the water at these intersections was quite calm comparatively speaking. Though the borders to this intersection were likewise extraordinarily dangerous due to the clashing waves. This was as close to a terrain advantage as Lionel could find on the waters aside from a few waterfall formations that could be found around the planet. But he knew that he needed something better than this, which was why he was happy to have found Principles of Wood Elemental Architecture. Though the boundaries of this intersection were especially violent, the range of the calm water had a several kilometer wide diameter. It looked so much like a lake as opposed to the clash of 3 rivers that this was exactly what Lionel called it, Lake Crossing. The 3 main rivers, named West River, Southeast River and Northeast River by Lionel, met at their curves. Rather than actually crossing each other, the intersection was like a joining of 3 U-shapes at their base to form a sort of triangle with curved edges. The locations where just 2 rivers met were exceptionally volatile, giving the region some cover. But the main issue was that Lake Crossing had bodies of land as well. These bodies of land were exactly the weakness of this location and exactly the reason why Lionel wasn't confident in this terrain advantage. However, now with Principles of Wood Elemental Architecture, Lionel was confident in fortifying these entry points to the water, and that was exactly what he did. The result was a grand fort formation that became the result of less than a week's work. Visit. For a better user experience, sitting right at the center of Lake Crossing an enormous fort lay. Taking inspiration from the Slayer Legion, it was like a large metal cube sitting on the calm waters. It was impossible to tell how deep into the waters it went, but the top of this cube reached up more than 20 meters. This cube, or at least what appeared to be a cube, was connected with chains so large that its links dwarfed the size of a human body. These chains anchored to the land around it, keeping the cube in place. Upon the surface of these lands, grand wooden constructions stood. At first glance, it looked no different from a normal wide-ranging and thick forest of brown and green. However, the longer you looked, the more exaggerated it all seemed to become. Enormous tree homes, interconnected pathways, and most importantly defensive structures that took the earth itself as their foundation. The most shocking part of it all was that would force continue to accumulate and grow in the surroundings. The trees absorbed this force greedily, speeding along their evolution far faster than the rest of Earth X1 one after another. These trees grew thicker and wider, breaking into the fifth dimension one after another and showing not a single sign of slowing down. The first day this tree fort was created, its defenses could only be considered to be all right. But come the third, fourth, fifth day and beyond, the sturdiness of it all dwarfed what Lionel could have created with his current crafting prowess, at least not on the time crunch he was on. It could be said that the evergreen goddess had truly left Lionel a great boon. Lionel stood in the midst of the forest. On his lap lay a spear that seemed to be made of green vines and had a blade that looked like the closed petals of a pink rose. It radiated the aura of a quasi-silver spear and sat docilely before Lionel, seemingly not minding at all that he didn't even have the slightest wood elemental affinity to speak of. The latest _IP_SODIs are on the website. When controlling spears he didn't have an affinity for, Lionel often had to spend 2, 3, maybe even 10 times the stamina he would normally. But he had no other choice in this matter. Only he could comprehend the evergreen goddess text and execute the completion of this fort fast enough. Luckily, he had the golden-scaled koi fish to help him quickly replenish his stamina, or else things would have been even more troublesome. The good news, though, was that manipulating fourth-dimensional trees was much easier. If these trees had already become fifth-dimensional, Lionel might not be able to accomplish this even with several months. Comprehending the artistic conception was easy for him, though. He just had to manipulate the fourth-dimensional trees into fifth-dimensional levels of complexity and watch the force do the work for him. I need to be fast. I need to finish all the forts before Earth X1 and undergo a qualitative change under Earth's influence. I'm still too slow. Lionel suddenly looked up. They're here, right? Arthur appeared in a streak of light. Whether it was Gil or Lionel himself, there was no doubt that Arthur had the fastest speed. It couldn't be helped, he could quite literally deconstruct himself into the light element at will. Seems you know already. Arthur responded. Lionel sighed. I wanted to take over both lake crossings, that way we'd always have the decisive advantage, but my wood affinity is just too weak. I couldn't finish here fast enough. Visit. For the best no_undersing experience. Arthur's lip twitched. Lionel had created such an elaborate fort in less than a week. It was practically impenetrable. Only a fool would attack it without several months of preparation. The fact he accomplished this was enough. But Lionel didn't feel this to be true. He felt an anxiousness in his heart that he couldn't seem to get rid of. He needed to be faster, to be better. They had known from the very beginning that there were 2 points that all 3 rivers met at. Unfortunately, Lionel could only choose to build one base at a time. There's no need to worry. They should have just arrived. It would be impossible for them to set up any sort of powerful defenses. In fact, they might very well be fighting amongst themselves for such a prime spot. Chem? Lionel's gaze narrowed. Arthur looked into the distance, his gaze also turning somewhat gloomy. It seems they want to test how good this fort is too. Arthur said lightly. Leave this to you? Lionel asked. No problem. Arthur laughed, his blade had been dry for too long. Make sure to give those other bastards hell. Visit. For a better user experience, Lionel's lip curled into a smile. It seems that they really thought that Earth was ripe for the picking. It was about time they entered the grand stage and showed them all just what made Earth so talented to begin with. Chapter 1031. Beneath Lake Crossing, an opening of the cube suddenly widened, causing a rush of water to flood in. As calm as the surface seemed, the underwater current charged around like hidden flood dragons hiding in the dark. The moment this opening was breached, several speedboats jetted out like submarines, following these underwater currents until they blasted through the surface, appearing on the opposing side of the water barriers in a single blink. Lionel appeared at the helm of one of these speedboats, his expression serious as the sleek watercraft accelerated along with the currents. He was under no illusions that this matter would be simple to handle. On the other side of Earth X1, as Lionel had already guessed, the sparks of battle were already being slowly lit. Much like the first lake crossing, this intersection of the west, northeast and southeast rivers was likewise a connection of U-shapes. And it had to be understood that the reason Lionel had given the rivers these names were because of their locations on Earth X1. The 3 main rivers were like irregularly shaped circles claiming a section of the planet for themselves. The West River circled around basically the whole left side of the planet, and the remaining 2 followed the same pattern. Ultimately, these 3 rivers met as a unit twice, and these were easily chosen to be the best locations. As a result, a portion of the individuals who targeted Earth X1 shot for one of these points while another portion shot for the other. Visit. For a better user experience, the competition was fierce and the battlefield became no different from a powder keg ready to explode at any time, no single individual willing to take a step backward. Such a defensible position on a planet without large mountain ranges or valleys was about the best they could hope for. How could they allow others to have it? This is troublesome. Donville, a familiar petite young lady of Radix family Libli, stood in the depths of the forest, eyeing the second lake crossing through the foliage. Though the appearance of the others weren't yet obvious, she hadn't let down her guard, nor did she make any big movements just yet. Much like the others, they had chosen a separate location on planet Earth X1 to build a temporary fort before sending a vanguard to scout out this region. There was no doubt that at least half of their most powerful warriors were here. Rho Alpha, everyone hid in the shadows, watching for the movements of everyone else, and none seeming to want to take the first step. Young Mississippi, a middle-aged man of the Radix family, stepped forward. Rho visit. For the best no_underscore experience, is the scouting complete? Libli asked without looking back. The middle-aged man reached out toward the air and allowed a dark gold moth to land on his hand. At first, it seemed no different from a member of the small creature race. However, upon second inspection, one would be shocked to find that the dark gold moth was actually not living at all. Rather, it was a delicately constructed mechanism of parts. We've deployed 9,283 scouting units successfully, and the planet has been mapped out to about 38%. 38%? Good. Continue your report. Libli nodded, satisfied with this result. It might sound like a small number, but 100% would entail mapping everything even down to the core of the planet. This would include the river's floors and potential hidden pathways as well. 38% was already far more than they needed. There are a total of 6 powers that have targeted this world. This includes all those that are potential threats. If non-factors are accounted for, there are as many as 31. However, much of this number either includes those who are acting on an individual or small-scale basis, or they encompass families and organizations that have overestimated themselves. Detail the 7. Libli spoke coolly, clearly not caring for the full 31 number. It would be a waste of time to do so. Yes. The first are the Evergreen Goddess religion. They have set up a shrine at these coordinates. However, they don't seem to have made a move just yet, and the scouts don't dare to get too close. Visit. For the best no_underscore experience, Libli's gaze narrowed. Religions were making their move as well. It seemed that they had to be cautious. There was no need to offend a god without reason, and there was also no real conflict of interest, at least for now. So long as the church didn't go too far, they could coexist. The second is ourselves. The third through fifth are all individuals that come from outside the Milky Way just like we do. There's the Rain family, the Umbra family, and the Flora family. The Rain family has set up their base at the North Pole. The Umbra family has taken the south. The Flora family has taken the largest stretch of land, the center island, as theirs. The Rain, Umbra, and Flora families. Though the Libli hadn't had run-ins with them all, she knew them well as they knew her. They had all been vying for position in the Milky Way for a long while already. And, on top of that, they were as close to mortal enemies with the Flora family as one could get. When it came to matters between the Flora and Midas Radix families, their philosophies were too antithetical to one another to coexist. And the final? They are the powerhouse of this quadrant. Well, not just this quadrant, but of this galaxy as a whole. The Krars family. They have the most flexibility when it comes to this war. They have many worlds that they control near Earth's borders and are also under the most threat from Earth's current advancements. Earth's fold of reality missed them this time, but when Earth enters the 6th dimension, they will be finished. They have no choice but to go all out now. And their position is probably the most powerful on this world. Libli took these words in and fell into deep contemplation. Visit. For the best no_underscore experience. Chapter 1032. If Lionel had been there to hear the name Krars, he would have immediately realized that everything the middle-aged man said was true. During the war with Terrain, a few citizens of Krars had ended up getting caught in the conflict. These individuals had all been arrogant and lofty despite the fact they came from worlds like Krars X10 and even YS in some cases. It was no surprise they were so arrogant, though, considering the strength of their world. Now it seemed that Krars had no choice but to target Earth. When one fold of reality swallowed another, or more accurately, when a higher dimensional fold of reality swallowed a lower dimensional one, the original would be erased and its world spirit would be swallowed. This meant Krar's world would no longer be Krar's at all but would rather become a world of Earth. This would effectively cripple an entire generation of Krar's citizens. The only way to escape this fate was by claiming territory within Earth's domain and rooting the world spirit to it. In this way, Krar's people would have a route to survive and maintain their sovereignty without being swallowed up by another. It could even be said that there were many worlds that had exactly this same thought process. As much as this was about greed for Earth's resources, it was also a matter of survival. Does it seem like their entire focus is on this world? Libly asked. Well? Before the middle-aged man could answer, an enormous anchor fell onto the second lake crossing. A pillar of water shot up into the skies, covering up what it was that had landed. At first, Libly immediately went on high alert, as did the individuals hidden in the surroundings. If this was some sort of bomb, they had to be prepared to protect themselves. But what actually happened next left them stunned. The latest _IP_SODIs are on the website. The pillar of water crashed down, sending a rain into the surroundings. Considering Earth X1 was almost always precipitating anyway, even if there seemed to be no clouds up above, it hardly changed anything. What was a point of caution, though, was what the descending waters allowed to be revealed. A spider beast sat at the center of the second lake crossing. Even without using force, its 8 limbs held it above the waters, its beady crimson eyes looking like a set of shimmering rubies. It was at least 20 meters long, wore blinding silver armor, and it released a nauseating clicking sound every so often that made one's stomach turn over. It was almost like one could hear its inner organs digesting whatever it was that it had just eaten. Don Velatop this spider beast stood a group of a dozen. Compared to the youths sent by the Radix, Rain, Umbra and Flora families, it was clear that these individuals were a tick older. But this could only be expected. All 4 of those families were of the 6th dimension but could send such experts in currently. As such, they could only send the younger generation. Roelfalfig the Krar's family, though, was just a 5th-dimensional family held back by the weak talent of the Milky Way galaxy overall. As such, most talents they did have were already older, having been stuck at the pinnacle of the 5th dimension for decades already. Except for 2. And these 2 happened to be a pair of twins that stood at the helm of the spider beast, both radiating the aura of a Tier 9 5th-dimensional existence. Yet they were both exceptionally young. If not for knowing better, most would think that they were still in their late teens. I think this hiding isn't doing us any good, right? One of the twins spoke. If none of you will come out, we will simply take this base for ourselves. Veronica. The moment the twins spoke these words, the spider beneath them opened up its jaw and raised its large abdomen into the air. Before anyone could react, a spiraling pillar of webs that sparkled like a cross between silk and diamonds shot upward. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience in just a few seconds, the entirety of Lake Crossing had been covered in a thick platform of web. Just a slight moment of hesitation had allowed the Krar's twins to take the initiative. There were truly very few who dared to take a step onto that web. Just at a glance, it wasn't difficult to tell that this web was incredibly sticky. From Libly's calculations, she felt that just walking along it would take about 3 to 4 times the amount of force they would use on water normally just to keep themselves from getting stuck. On top of this, there was a high likelihood that the web was also poisonous and may very well already be spreading a silent killer into the air. Ausen, poison detection. Libly commanded. Yes. The middle-aged man released the moth for just a moment before his expression changed. Nerve-numbing. Airborne. I see. Libly took out her radix cube and fused force into it. With a click, what looked like a spider jumped out with its legs and clamped onto her face. Very soon, the lower half of her face including her nose were covered by a bronze mask. Was come. Young miss, it seems that the Rain and Flora family have attacked Earth's base. As for the rest, the evergreen clergymen don't seem to have made a move while the Umbra family is very, very difficult to find. That said, there is an uptick of about 0.1% of atmospheric dark elemental force in the general surroundings. According to our information, there's a 97% chance that the Umbra family is already here. The latest _IP_SODIs are on the website. As Ausen spoke, he too used his radix cube to cover his face. Gather the vanguard, it's time to move. We can't let them do as they please. Libly's words had hardly fallen when several sides of darkness cut at the large platform of spiders' webs from all sides. The speed was so fast that the twins could only narrow their gazes as a large chunk of their foundation was ripped apart. When it came to a stop, the whispering fog of several shadows drifted into the air, disappearing one after another. However, just one stayed behind, a cheeky grin on his face. This young man was exceptionally pale and was lanky to almost an extreme. And if Lionel had been there to see him, he would have been shocked, because this young man was none other than Radley's, the first friend Lionel had ever made on Valiant Heart Mountain. He twirled twin short swords in his hands as his body seemed to drift into the wind. His legs disappeared into fog and his torso quickly followed suit. Eventually, there was just his head and his cheeky grin remaining. "I've been suppressing myself for too long. Since you'd like to play, let's play. That's what my Umbra family does best." The instant Radlys vanished, the clinking of armor resounded as the Radix family charged forth. A three-way battle erupted with hardly any warning, sending the calm water of the lake into a frenzy. Bronze force, dark elemental force, and a spider's web all spiraled out of control. Chaos descended upon the second lake crossing. The latest _sodies are on the website. Chapter 1033. The battlefield had less than 50 people taking part. It was clear they all had a tacit understanding that this was a place reserved for elites and elites alone. Anyone else would only be like fodder to a flame. Libly and Radlys clashed with the twins. The latter seemed to flicker in and out of existence as he pleased, while the former had already put on an entire mech suit. From a delicate and petite young lady, she had become a bronze behemoth. Back on planet Solara, there were certain delicate mechanisms that she didn't dare to deploy for fear the planet's environment would destroy them. But now she had no qualms at all. Her one enormous bronze arm billowed with the odd bronze force and endless steam. Her slender arm was quick and flexible, sending out blades of energy that pressed one of the twins down. Radley's twin short swords were like arcs of black lightning. They appeared without warning, struck with unconscious speed, and moved like deathly shadows. "Not bad." Radlys laughed as he vanished and appeared on a whim. "I thought that only those two would be good in this galaxy, but it turned out that there were other talents here too. It's a shame you aren't a woman, or else I'd want to take you as a concubine." The Krar's twin remained indifferent to Radley's taunting. All around him, shields of spider web silk hung around him. In total, there were at least a dozen, each of which was just a foot in diameter. The twins' fingers moved about with a deft swiftness, controlling both these shields and several hiltless blades. In his battle with Libly, the other twin also seemed to use the same silk-based ability, their flexibility in battle coming as no joke. The latest _sodies are on the website. Just earlier, Veronica, the spider beast, had vanished and became a tattoo on the latter twin's back. However, this was impossible to see as this twin wore flexible armor throughout his body. All that was possible for the others to tell was that these two brothers seemed to have abilities related to the very spider they had just ridden. Radley suddenly found a silk thread attached to his blade, catching him somewhat off guard. With a quick deployment of his dark elemental force, it began to corrode. But the process was far too slow, showing just the kind of strength these silk strings had. "You could never defeat us." The twin spoke plainly. "This world is ours." The twin's finger flexed, causing a surge of energy to threaten to snap Radley's wrist if he didn't release his weapon. At the same time, a hiltless blade shot toward his compromised arm, aiming to pierce through the left of Radley's chest completely. Radley suddenly chuckled. "I managed to survive that lovesick woman while hiding my strength for 2 years. What makes you think this is enough to deal with me?" Donval Radley's back suddenly erupted with tendrils of dark energy. Soon, though, it became clear that they were actually several tails, of which there were 3 in total. With a bang, one shattered the ceiling of the speed of sound. Like a streaking shadow, it whipped through the air, slamming against the incoming hiltless blade and sending it spiraling into the air. Before the twin could regain control of it, Radley's tail shot up, wrapping around it tightly and sending it flying. The air felt as though it was being cut apart. The strength of Radley's tail was completely beyond the expectations of the twin. Several of his spiderweb shields shot out, lining up in a line to block the incoming blow. Visit. For the best no_NG experiences. It took 3 shields before the blade finally got stuck in the 4th. However, before he could even have a chance at catching his breath, Radleys, who had vanished into thin air, appeared with his short sword at his throat. At that moment, on the other side of the battlefield, Libly's battle with the other twin was raging on just as fiercely. Without having to hold back, Libly's actions flowed far more smoothly from one action to another. It was as though she had an endless supply of mechanisms, each more lethal than the last. Chains, needles, hidden blades and spikes, extending arms and legs. The array of options she had felt infinite, and it was quickly becoming more and more difficult for the second twin to read and react. No matter how many shields he had, none of it seemed to be enough. Libly's massive steampunk bronze arm rotated a quarter, causing several small holes to appear at a joint. An eruption of 9 missiles shot out in a rotating and spiraling circle as though they were coordinating themselves in the air. The twin shot backward explosively, sending out several shields. Trying to use the massive fog as a cover, he sent out several hiltless blades. Beneath the cloud of explosions and their noise, it should have been impossible for Libly to react. The aftershock sent the twin flying, his feet losing their balance as he was blown backward. But, completely out of his expectations, he found that he suddenly couldn't fly any further. To the twin's horror, a chain had wrapped around his ankle. Without even a chance to fight back, he was reeled back into the range of the explosion just in time for the final chain of missiles to implode. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience just like that, at seemingly the exact same time, one twin lost their head and another was blown to bits, falling within split moments of each other. The fog around Libly slowly dispersed while the surge of dark elemental force around Radleys calmed. The darkness that had taken over Radley's gaze began to pale as he looked toward Libly with a fiendish grin. "You're quite a beauty. It's a shame that you're not my type. I like more voluptuous women." Radley's gaze went blank as he thought back to the large breasts of Balthorn. He almost began to drool. Libly didn't react much to Radley's words, simply brandishing her weapons and pulling back her chains. But before the two could battle, the sound of 2 voices caused their pupils to constrict. "See, I told you, D. We're at too much of a disadvantage. The Milky Way is too untalented, we can't beat them one-on-one like this." "Fuck off, Dre. I'm unresigned. This is bullshit. Wouldn't everything be alright once we take Earth's talent for our own? Then nothing would hold us back any longer. For now, just listen to me." Libly and Radleys turned their gazes to find an enormous bird hovering in the skies. On its back, 2 individuals that they should have just killed stood, perfectly fine as though nothing had happened. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, since our talent isn't good enough, well, just drown them in numbers. At that moment, the sky that was fairly clear aside from the light drizzle of a few clouds suddenly warped. From just a single bird, there were suddenly hundreds, each of them with squadrons of 10 on their backs. Instantly, a battlefield that barely had 50 people suddenly ballooned into one where a side had thousands in a single blink. Libly and Radley's pupils constricted into pinholes. Chapter 1034. Libly, who liked to calculate everything before she even took a single step, realized that she had been played. She couldn't quite grasp what ability had been used to string her along like this, but it didn't particularly matter right now. All she knew was that there was trouble. Scanning the current state of the battlefield, all of her elite troops had been spread apart, as were Radley's. On top of this, they were being pinned down by the elite troops that the twins had led forward earlier, making it difficult for them to regroup. Libly had thought they all had the tacit understanding that this would be a battle of elites and had gotten complacent. After all, as much of a powerhouse as Krars was in this galaxy, their main ability came in their foundation and their numbers. But if they were willingly tossing such an advantage away, she had been willing to gladly take such a benefit for herself. However, Libly had forgotten one important piece of information. Roelfraelfjausen had informed her of where the Rain, Umbra and Flora families had set up their bases. But he had never said anything about where the Krars family had set up theirs. It was only now she understood that they had never set one up to begin with. From the very beginning, their only target had always been this second lake crossing. Regroup. Libly raised her enormous mechanical arm, pointing its massive fingers forward. Mechanisms on their tips opened up and shot out a rapid hail of bullets as she tried to cover for her people's retreat. But how could Dee and Dre allow such a thing? They had revealed their true cards at the perfect time and they would most definitely take advantage. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience right at that moment, the birds dove down from the skies. One would have thought that they would slow as they approached the water, but it was the exact opposite. They accelerated like speeding bullets, their feathers ripping from their bodies one after another. However, if one looked closely, those very feathers turned into an odd inky energy as they fluttered away, sinking back into Dre's body. Bang, 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 bang. Donvelth birds, without a care for their lives, crashed full speed into the waters below. At that moment, an inky blackness was cast over all of their visions, making it impossible to see what was happening. Before Libli could even regain her bearings as the water beneath her rose and fell like tides, her bronze armor jumped into action on its own, blocking a strike to her left. Libli's gaze narrowed. Her armor only acted without her expressed command under very few situations. She realized then that her life was truly in danger. The inky blackness dispersed, revealing the state of the battlefield once more. But now Libli found herself surrounded from all sides. With the Krars having claimed the very center of the battlefield, it had suddenly become impossible for any regrouping to take place. Under normal circumstances, this would have been a terrible move to make, as it essentially forced the Krars to be pincered from all sides. However, with so few people being on the battlefield to begin with and many birds still hanging in the skies with hundreds more attackers, it felt like the perfect action for this given situation. Libli immediately found herself embroiled in battle. For the first time in her life, she actually regretted not bringing that massive meathead somewhere. However, she had had no choice but to leave her husband to be back at their base so that there would be someone there to defend should Earth send a preemptive attack. Row visit. For the best no_underscored_ng experience, we need to retreat. It seems we'll really have to give up this location. If they build an entire base of that spider silk, it'll be difficult to take this back without at least a few thousand troops. But even then, Libli's mind spun as she thought. The bare minimum requirement for attacking this second lake crossing once the Krars had established themselves would be an antidote for this nerve-numbing poison that was slowly accumulating in the air. Not everyone of the Radix family had good enough crafting skill to block this poison like she did. And the Umbra family was known for their immunity to such things, and Libli truly didn't want to let them have the upper hand. Damn it. Retreat. No sequence. Libli's mask projected her voice over the battlefield. Her words told her men to use whatever means to escape they had. Without a sequence allowed them to scatter. Dre and Dee, who were still in the skies, smirked when they saw the attempted retreat. They acted in unison, fitting themselves into all sort of twinning stereotypes. Fire at will. Dre said lightly. Those who remained on the backs of the birds weren't just anyone, they were the best marksmen the Krars Empire had to offer. They weren't fearful of being pincered because they simply had the best cover imaginable. They had essentially started an air fight on a group of people who were clearly not ready for one. Visit. For the best no_underscored_ng experience, Radlis' gaze narrowed. When it came to escape, his people were probably the best. But it was difficult when they were forced to engage in battle like this. They needed both time and space to vanish like they usually did. And unfortunately, the sun was still too high in the sky to lower the requirements. The marksmen above began to target the escaping Radix family members together. If one wasn't enough, 3 or 4 volleys were often sent. The casualties began to slowly increase. It was right then that the situation on the battlefield changed once again. Dre subconsciously looked in a certain direction, his gaze narrowing when he saw an array of speed boats racing down the river. In fact, much like the clergyman, he almost hadn't noticed them at all. Shoot them, do. Dre hadn't even finished his commands when a beam of golden light tore through the skies, ripping through the throat of his bird. In the distance, still just over 2 kilometers away, Lionel frowned, holding his sniper rifle in his hand. The latest _SODIs are on _the website. The birds aren't real? In that case, let's do this. Dre and Dee fell from the skies, an inky blackness hanging around them. Unfortunately for them, Lionel had already locked on. Chapter 1035. Lionel's palm flipped over, revealing a sleek and simple bow. It was the very same bow he had gotten from the Camelot zone. Though it was just a quasi-bronze treasure, when it came to this battlefield, it was already among the best weapons in appearance. And, when it came to matters of marksmanship, Lionel truly didn't need anything more than just this. In the blink of an eye, 6 arrows appeared on Lionel's bowstring at once. As though he hardly needed to calculate anything, they shot outward, piercing through the throats of just as many birds in what felt like an instant. No amount of maneuvering seemed to matter. With every light breath Lionel took, another bird fell from the sky. His single arrow seemed to be capable of covering the whole battlefield. No matter how many barricades you stood behind, no matter how much effort you put into running, it was all meaningless. Lionel's body and the bow seemed to vanish. No, it wasn't that it had vanished, but rather that they seemed to have become one. The twang of the bow string was no different from a flex of Lionel's arm or a whipping of his leg. The curve of the bow's body was no different from a tensing of Lionel's spine and a priming of his heart. It had been so long since Lionel used a bow, rather choosing to rely on his crafting skill to create powerful sniper rifles. The only reason he was using it now was because he realized that it was a more efficient use of his stamina. Even though the sniper rifle didn't drain him like it once did in the past, it still packed a punch. However, Lionel never expected to suddenly become immersed in this feeling he hadn't touched upon in such a long time. There was something about the bow that existed on a plane separate from the gun. No matter how hard Lionel tried, he always felt that there was a barrier between him and his guns truly breathing as one. And yet, that barrier seemed to be as thin as a sheet of wet paper when he picked up his bow. Visit. For a better user experience, Lionel asked himself the same question he had asked of his spear. What was so special about bow force? It was a funny question because Lionel wasn't even certain that he had ever used bow force before. Had he ever grasped it? In truth, he wasn't really sure. He thought he had, maybe, possibly. But had he really? Likely not. For a long while, he hadn't felt that there was any difference between the weapon forces. They just made things sharper, right? In that case, why grasp bow force when he could just attach spear force to his arrows? Wasn't it the same thing regardless? Unknowingly, Lionel had restricted his bow force in this way, making what he had comprehended from Merlin's trial quite benign and useless. So he asked himself again. What separated bow force from other forces? It felt like the answer was range again. In fact, it felt like the answer was range times 10. But Lionel felt unsatisfied with this answer. It wasn't because this answer was wrong. In fact, it was correct. The reason he was unsatisfied was because he felt that it was too simple. Lionel fell into a trance-like state. His fingers moved faster and faster, and the arrows he released seemed to blot out the skies all on their own. Before the boat had even crossed from 2 kilometers away to just a single kilometer, more than half of the birds in the sky had been slaughtered. Visit. For the best understanding experience at that moment, Lionel entered the range of the Krar's marksmen and they began to try to snipe him out of the skies before Lionel could get to them. But that was when something Radley's, Libley and the twins would never forget in their lifetimes happened. Lionel's speed hit a new gear. He ran out of arrows and simply began to form them with his earth force. His arm became like a blur and the bowstring often didn't even have a chance to settle before he slotted another arrow in and pulled. At that moment they all witnessed a single bowman facing off against dozens. Lionel sent out several volleys, his arrows perfectly clashing with the ones the Krar's marksmen released. At first, it was even and they seemed to have reached a stalemate. The clashing in the skies grew resounding, flashing lights of all colors coming from one side only to be blocked by a curtain of bronze from another. It was as though the arrows had become no different from droplets of rain rebounding against one another in the sky. But then the situation changed. Lionel's arrows began to skim against the sides of the oncoming arrows. It seemed that he had missed at first, but then it became clear that a single one of Lionel's arrows began to disrupt the path of 2 others. Then 3 others. Then 4 others. Bang! A surging aura burst from Lionel's body. A golden spear light flickered into and out of existence on Lionel's forehead as though it was fighting back against something, but it was to no avail. Lionel's arrows suddenly gained life of their own. Rather than speeding up, his pace suddenly slowed. And yet, under the astonished gazes of those watching on, it wasn't Lionel who began to lose, but rather the marksmen of Krar's. Visit. For a better user experience, Lionel took a light breath, an arrow releasing along with his exhale. It curved through the skies, skimming against the side of one arrow after another. It used the arrows of the Krar's marksmen almost like a racetrack, its trajectory curving along as though it had a mind of its own. The neck of a bird was pierced right through, the very first one to be felled in the last several exchanges. It felt as though the battlefield had fallen into an eerie silence, a single young man with a blazing aura becoming the center of attention. Range was indeed too simple to describe Lionel's feelings for the bow. When he held it in his hands, he had an indelible confidence. What separated Lionel's bow force from his other forces? It was the fact it was his bow force. With a single arrow I can do anything. A mighty violet fog billowed to life around him. Visit for a better user experience. Chapter 1036. What Lionel had needed to understand was why range felt like too simple of an answer to him, and it had only taken a moment to do so. The truth was that it was too simple because Lionel's state of mind when it came to the bow was far beyond his state of mind when it came to the spear. The reality was that despite having a lineage factor related to the spear, and even having the spear domain heirloom, his thought process revolved much more around the bow than it ever did the spear. Much like how switching to wooden spears for a long while helped Lionel grasp something he had been missing, so too did using his sniper rifle for so long. It made seeing the fundamental difference so much clearer. The reality was that Lionel's explanation was much more complex for the bow because if his spear force could be considered to have stepped into level 2, then Lionel's bow force had just entered level 3, skipping over level 2 entirely. Lionel was sure that there were probably names and categories for this stuff already documented, but he had purposely not used the dictionary to learn about them. He didn't want his progress in this fashion to be influenced by anything else. It was quite interesting. Lionel was always worried about missing out and had always wanted to learn as much as he could about everything. But, for some reason when it came to his spear and his bow, he wanted the exact opposite. Something about them felt deeply personal in a way he found difficult to describe. In the end he chose to follow his gut. And as things stood now, it was doing wonders for him. Lionel released another arrow, but the result of this one caused the expressions of everyone around to change wildly. The air around the arrow vibrated out of control and the force in the surroundings seemed to distort. It hadn't even reached its destination yet, and yet not a single soul failed to see through its danger. Dee and Dre, who were among the very first to fall victim to Lionel's arrows and lose their bird, had their pupils constrict. The latest _IP_SODIs are on the website. Dre had been waiting for the archers to deal with Lionel first before he deployed his bird once again to command to the battlefield. But to his shock and horror, Lionel alone had actually rendered his men completely useless. And now this arrow, SHU. Lionel blinked. I missed? Lionel was baffled. Even back to the days when he was a normal boy playing quarterback on a football field, he had never missed. It sounded ridiculous, but it was the truth. Lionel couldn't ever remember being inaccurate in his life. And yet, for the first time, he actually missed? Bang. The sight was devastating. Lionel's arrow passed over the head of a bird, missing its neck. However, just as it did so, it was as though everything ruptured. The head and part of the bird's torso was shredded to pieces. The marksman on its back screamed in horror as they too were torn and ripped apart. It was as though a spinning vortex of space element force whipped by, forming a black hole that pulled everything apart and left nothing but droplets of blood, flesh and an inky blackness. Visit. For the best no_undersync experience, the space in the surroundings continued to tremble as the arrow shot into the distance. As though it was a nuke, everyone on the battlefield scattered, rushing out of the range of the arrow before it could get anywhere near them. Bang. The arrow collided with the calm waters of the second lake crossing. A devastating whirlpool formed and water as sharp as knives and needles jetted out in all directions. Screams of agony and pain erupted. Those that hadn't managed to get far enough away found themselves sucked in, the devastation of the arrow shocking them to their cores and reaping their lives. At least a dozen fell into the silence of death in that one instant. Lionel frowned, raising his hand to his bow again. But, right as he was about to fire again, he felt his forearm spasm and a large chunk of his mental stability vanish. What the hell? Lionel's mind spun, his near-perfect recall activating as he replayed what had just happened. When he came to an understanding, his expression became somewhat solemn. His bow force had actually surpassed a level he could casually sustain. There wasn't much of an impact on his body as bow force came from the external, but his mental focus took a huge hit. It felt as though he was a normal human again and had just spent all day studying. It was exaggerated to the point he couldn't lift a single finger any longer. But, Lionel felt like his current self only had about 2 more of these arrows in him before he really wouldn't be able to think straight anymore. The latest _IP_SODIs are on the website. Unless I use auspicious air. But even then I think I would only be able to increase the number by 1. I never thought that would become a problem. What Lionel didn't know was that this was only natural. His so-called level 3 bow force was actually a concept usually only grasped by those at the 6th dimension, something he would know had he done his research. In fact, It couldn't even show its full strength due to Lionel's current limitations. Lionel could sulk about this and be unhappy. But was it even necessary? 3 more of these arrows to end this battle? Lionel grinned. Isn't that too easy? Lionel had had many plans brewing in his mind for how to deal with this battle, but he hadn't expected to have such a breakthrough before it even started. In fact, as long as he wanted, he could lower his bow force to level 2 and not have to worry about this drawback at all. However, where would the fun in that be? It was about time these people understood that what they should fear wasn't those vying for a piece of Earth along with them. What they should fear was Earth itself. Lionel raised his bow again, his free hand drawing 2 fingers together from the curve of the bow down the string. Everywhere his 2 fingers passed, a shimmering bronze arrow of Earth force formed, wrapped in spiraling level 3 bow force. Retreat. Visit. For the best no-understanding experience, the roars came from all over the battlefield as the same thought resounded in Lionel's mind once again. With a single arrow, I can do anything. You're tuning in to the Han Lee's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.